Far from the gleaming spires of Terra, across the vast emptiness of space, lies a world of stark contrasts and ancient traditions, Chogoris, known in imperial cartographs as Mundus Planus. Here, beneath the shadow of towering mountain ranges and across sweeping steppes that stretch to distant horizons, the White Scars Legion found its spiritual and cultural heart. The world that would forge the character of the Fifth Legion stands as a testament to the diversity of human civilization in the galaxy, and to the Emperor's wisdom in selecting such varied environments to shape his superhuman warriors. Chogoris presents a dichotomy of civilization that few worlds can match. Its western regions host the sprawling Palatine Empire, a highly organized society of walled cities, rigid social hierarchies, and technological advancement that would not seem out of place on many compliant imperial worlds. The Palatine culture valued order, structure, and the subjugation of what they deemed lesser peoples. Their armies marched in perfect formation, their weapons standardized, their tactics refined through centuries of warfare against the eastern tribes they considered barbarians. In stark contrast, the vast eastern plains of Chogoris belonged to the nomadic tribes, horse warriors who lived by ancient codes of honor, following the seasons across the endless steppes. These nomads organized themselves into tribal confederations, each with distinct customs and traditions, yet united by their reverence for the open sky, martial prowess, and spiritual connection to their homeland. Their warfare was as different from the Palatine approach as their lifestyle, swift, decisive, and deeply personal. Where Palatine soldiers fought in rigid formations behind shields, the Plains warriors struck from horseback with composite bows and curved sabers, vanishing before a counterattack could be mounted. This division of cultures was not merely geographical but fundamentally philosophical. The Palatine Empire represented stagnation, tyranny, and the suppression of human potential through rigid hierarchy. The nomadic tribes, despite their seemingly primitive technology, embodied freedom, adaptability, and personal excellence, values that would later define the White Scars Legion's approach to warfare and brotherhood. The nomadic peoples lived in circular felt tents called jurs, easily dismantled and transported as they followed the migrations of their herds. Their social structure revolved around the tribe and the clan, with leadership earned through deeds rather than inherited through bloodlines. Young warriors gained status through their skill in hunting, riding, and combat, participating in ritual competitions that tested not just physical prowess but tactical acumen and spiritual fortitude. At the heart of tribal life was the relationship between warrior and mount. The horses of Chogoris were not mere beasts of burden, but partners in survival and combat. Smaller than the massive war horses of other feudal worlds, but possessed of remarkable endurance and agility, these animals were bred for generations to work in perfect harmony with their riders. Children learned to ride before they could walk, developing a bond with their mounts that transcended simple mastery. This relationship would later inform the Legion's affinity for fast attack vehicles and their almost supernatural ability to operate as one with their machines. The nomadic tribes did not lack sophistication despite their mobile lifestyle. Their artisans created works of remarkable beauty, intricate patterns adorning saddles and weapons, detailed tapestries depicting tribal histories, and complex jewelry that served as both decoration and indicators of status. Their oral traditions preserved thousands of years of history, poetry, and spiritual teachings, passed from generation to generation by tribal elders. Perhaps most significant to the future Legion were the shamanic traditions that permeated tribal life. The steppe nomads recognized and revered those born with psychic potential, calling them weather seers or spirit walkers. Unlike many human cultures that feared such abilities, the Chogorian tribes integrated these individuals into their spiritual hierarchy, training them to communicate with the forces of nature and the spirits of ancestors. These shamans served as advisors to tribal khans, healers for the wounded, and interpreters of omens. The training of these psychic individuals followed ancient patterns. Young children showing signs of ability would be apprenticed to older shamans, learning to control their gifts through meditation, ritual, and communion with the natural world. They learned to read the patterns of clouds, interpret the behavior of animals, and perceive the subtle energies that flowed across the steppes. Most importantly, they were taught to resist the whispers that came from beyond the veil of reality, what later imperial doctrine would identify as the predatory entities of the warp. This tradition would evolve into the Stormseers of the White Scars, psychers whose disciplined approach to their abilities and spiritual grounding made them remarkably resistant to the corrupting influences that plagued many of their counterparts in other legions. The Stormseers combined the role of librarian, chaplain, and spiritual guide, preserving the Legion's traditions while channeling their psychic powers in service to their brothers. The tribes of Chogoris lived in perpetual conflict with the Palatine Empire, whose rulers viewed the nomads as savages to be conquered or exterminated. Imperial armies would march from their walled cities each campaign season, seeking to extend their dominion over the steppes. The technological superiority of Palatine forces, their black powder weapons, armored cavalry, and siege engines, was consistently countered by the nomads' superior mobility, knowledge of the terrain, and hit-and-run tactics. This centuries-long conflict shaped the martial traditions of the steppe tribes into a distinctive style of warfare that would later influence Legion doctrine. Unable to match Palatine forces in direct confrontation, the nomads developed sophisticated methods of asymmetric warfare. They would appear suddenly from unexpected directions, strike vulnerable points in enemy formations, and withdraw before effective resistance could be organized. They mastered the feigned retreat, luring pursuing forces into ambushes or exhausting them in fruitless chases across the endless plains. Tribal warriors trained from childhood in the use of multiple weapons, the composite bow that could strike with lethal accuracy from horseback, the curved saber designed for slashing attacks at speed, the light lance for initial charges, and the lasso for dismounting opponents. This versatility created warriors who could adapt to changing battlefield conditions without hesitation, a trait that would serve the Legion well in the complex campaigns of the Great Crusade. Leadership among the tribes was earned through demonstrated skill and wisdom rather than inherited position. While bloodlines mattered, the sons of Khans were given opportunities to prove themselves. Ultimate authority rested with those who could lead effectively in peace and war. Tribal Khans were expected to be the finest warriors, the wisest judges, and the most generous hosts. Those who failed in these duties found their followers drifting to more capable leaders, a meritocratic system that encouraged excellence at all levels. This approach to leadership would translate directly to the Legion's command structure, where officers were expected to lead from the front, demonstrating the skills they demanded from their warriors. The White Scars maintained formal rank structures as required by Legion organization, but actual authority often flowed to those who had proven themselves in battle regardless of technical position, a flexibility that sometimes confused outsiders but provided the Legion with exceptional battlefield adaptability. The spiritual beliefs of the Chogorian tribes centered on the eternal sky, the spirits of ancestors, and the sacred nature of the steppes themselves. They practiced a form of animism that recognized consciousness in natural forces and geographical features. Mountains, rivers, storms, and stars were not just physical phenomena, but entities with which humans could communicate through proper ritual and respect. This worldview fostered a deep connection to the natural cycles of their world and an acceptance of death as part of a greater pattern. When the Emperor's gene laboratories created the Primarchs, one of these transhuman beings was destined for Chogoris. The infant Primarch's gestation pod was swept through the warp to the eastern steppes, where he was found by Ong Khan, leader of a small tribe called the Talskars. Named Jaghatai, the child grew with supernatural speed and showed abilities far beyond those of normal humans. By the age of 5, he had killed his first adult warrior. By 10, he was leading warriors in battle. By 20, he had begun the unification of the steppe tribes under his leadership. Jaghatai's campaign to unite the tribes was not merely a military conquest, but a cultural revolution. He preserved the independence and traditions of individual tribes while binding them to a greater purpose. His confederation was built on mutual respect rather than subjugation, with each tribe contributing its unique strengths to the whole. This approach, unity through diversity rather than conformity, would later define his legion's organization. The newly unified tribes turned their attention to their ancient enemy, the Palatine Empire. Jagatai's campaign against the city-states was swift and merciless. Rather than adopting the siege warfare that had failed previous tribal leaders, he used the speed and mobility of his forces to isolate and destroy Palatine armies in the field. City after city fell, until the entire empire acknowledged his rule. Unlike many conquerors, however, Jaghatai did not destroy what he defeated. He incorporated useful elements of Palatine culture and technology into his confederation, while eliminating the oppressive aspects of their rule. By the time the emperor reached Chogoris, Jaghatai had unified the entire world under his leadership. The meeting between father and son was one of mutual respect rather than submission. Jaghatai recognized in the emperor a vision greater than his own and agreed to join the Great Crusade, but he negotiated terms that would protect Chogoris and its culture. This independence of spirit would characterize the Primarch's relationship with imperial authority throughout his service. The integration of Chogorian recruits into what had been the Star Hunters Legion transformed its character. While the original Terran members brought their own traditions and skills, the influx of warriors raised in the traditions of the steppes gradually shifted the Legion's tactics and culture. The White Scars, as they came to be known, adopted the lightning warfare of the nomads, emphasizing speed, precision strikes, and tactical flexibility over the more straightforward approaches favored by some of their brother legions. The cultural practices of Chogoris became embedded in Legion tradition. Warriors adorned their armor with tribal markings and totemic symbols. They practiced ritual scarification to commemorate significant battles and achievements. They composed and recited poetry celebrating the deeds of their brothers. Most significantly, they maintained the shamanic traditions of the steppes through the Order of Stormseers, who served as the Legion's librarians but retained distinctly Chogorian approaches to their psychic abilities. This transformation was not without friction. Some Terran veterans resisted the cultural shifts, particularly those related to spiritual practices that seemed to conflict with the imperial truth. Others embraced the new identity, finding in Chogorian traditions a sense of brotherhood and purpose that transcended mere military service. Over time, through the force of Jaghatai's personality and the demonstrated effectiveness of the new approach in battle, the Legion coalesced around its adopted culture. The winter winds howled across the steppes of Chogoris when the Talskar tribe discovered the strange metal pod embedded in frozen soil. Khan, the tribe's leader, approached the otherworldly object with caution, his weathered face illuminated by its faint glow. Inside lay not a demon or spirit as the superstitious might have feared, but a child, a boy with features similar to the tribespeople yet unmistakably different. His eyes held wisdom beyond mortal comprehension, and even as an infant, his physique suggested extraordinary potential. Khan named the child Jaghatai and raised him as his own son. The boy's development astonished the tribe. He grew at an accelerated rate that defied natural law. By the time most children were learning to string simple sentences together, Jaghatai was already taller than many adult warriors and demonstrated remarkable intellect. He absorbed the tribe's language, customs, and martial techniques with effortless precision, as if recovering memories rather than learning anew. The plains of eastern Chogoris served as Jaghatai's classroom. Under Khan's guidance, the young Primarch learned to ride the small, sturdy horses bred by the Talskars, initially struggling to find mounts strong enough to bear his rapidly growing frame. By age 5, he could outride any warrior in the tribe, maneuvering his steed with subtle shifts of weight rather than crude rein commands. The bond between rider and mount, so central to Chogorian culture, manifested in Jaghatai as something approaching telepathic communion. Hunting expeditions with Khan shaped Jaghatai's tactical thinking. The Primarch father taught his adopted son not merely to track and kill prey, but to understand the deeper patterns of movement across the steppes, how herds responded to predators, how weather influenced migration, how terrain determined the outcome of pursuit. On one notable hunt, Jaghatai tracked a snow leopard for 7 days through mountain passes considered impassable, returning with not only the prized pelt, but a comprehensive mental map of previously unknown routes through the peaks. A warrior sees not just with his eyes but with his mind, Khan often told the young Primarch during these expeditions. The enemy reveals himself in the grass he bends, the dust he raises, the patterns he cannot help but create. This lesson in reading subtle signs would later inform Jagatai's approach to warfare, seeing beyond immediate tactical situations to the strategic possibilities hidden beneath. The relative peace of Jagatai's early years ended abruptly when he was 10. A rival tribe, the Kurade, attacked the Talskar encampment while most warriors were away hunting. Khan died defending the tribe's elders and children. Jaghatai, returning from a solitary ride, found his foster father's body among dozens of slain tribespeople. The young Primarch tracked the Kurade raiders for 2 days before launching a one-man assault on their camp. Witnesses from captive Talskars later described how Jaghatai moved through the enemy like a wind spirit, killing 20 experienced warriors with nothing but a wooden spear and a hunting knife. This first taste of true combat awakened something primal in Jaghatai, not bloodlust as some might expect, but clarity. He gathered the survivors of his tribe and spoke his first recorded words of leadership. The steppes are wide, but there is no place distant enough to hide from justice. Over the following weeks, he systematically hunted down every Kurade warrior involved in the raid, not in blind vengeance, but in calculated retribution. Those who surrendered and acknowledged their dishonor were spared. Those who refused were executed with swift precision. With Khan dead, leadership of the Talskars fell naturally to Jaghatai despite his youth. His first decision established a pattern that would define his approach to command. He sought counsel from the tribe's elders, warriors, and shamans before making pronouncements. Unlike many who possess superhuman abilities, Jaghatai recognized that wisdom often resided in those with greater experience, even if they lacked his physical prowess. The Primarch's willingness to listen earned him loyalty beyond mere obedience. Under Jaghatai's leadership, the Talskars began to prosper. He implemented new hunting techniques that increased yields while preserving herd populations. He established training regimens for warriors that emphasized individual skill alongside coordinated group tactics. Most significantly, he reformed the tribe's approach to its neighbors, seeking alliances rather than continuing the cycle of raid and counter-raid that had dominated steppe politics for centuries. The young Khan's reputation spread across the eastern plains. Smaller tribes began to seek protection under the Talskar banner, attracted by Jaghatai's growing legend and his demonstrable success. By the time he reached physical maturity, a process completed in mere years rather than decades, Jaghatai commanded a confederation of 5 tribes, unified not through conquest but mutual agreement. This peaceful expansion ended when the Talskar Confederation encountered the borders of the Palatine Empire. A Palatine patrol, encountering nomad hunters on what they considered imperial territory, executed the tribesmen and sent their severed heads back to their families. Jaghatai's response was measured but decisive. He led a small force that ambushed the patrol responsible, killing them to the last man but leaving their bodies intact with a message carved into their commander's armor: "Justice demands equal measure, no more." The Palatine Emperor, unaccustomed to such defiance from the barbarians of the steppes, dispatched a punitive expedition, 5,000 soldiers with supporting artillery and cavalry. They expected to crush the upstart tribe in a single decisive battle. Instead, they found themselves drawn into a campaign of exhaustion. Jaghatai refused conventional engagement, instead employing hit-and-run tactics that targeted supply lines, isolated units, and command elements. The Primarch's force suffered minimal casualties while inflicting devastating losses on the Imperial force. After 3 months of frustration, the remnants of the expedition retreated to Palatine territory. This victory accelerated Jaghatai's unification of the steppe tribes. Warriors flocked to his banner, drawn by his tactical brilliance and the opportunity to strike back at their ancient oppressors. Within 2 years, Jaghatai commanded the largest confederation in Chogorian history, comprising over 30 tribes. Each maintained its distinct identity and traditions while accepting the Primarch's overall authority, a structure that prefigured the organization of the White Scars Legion. During this period of expansion, Jaghatai developed the philosophical principles that would define his approach to warfare and leadership. He formalized these ideas in a series of teachings later compiled as the Book of 5 Fates. Central to his philosophy was the concept of the laughing warrior, one who embraced combat not with hatred or fear but with joy and clarity. The warrior who fights with a light heart strikes truest, he taught. Anger clouds the eyes, hatred slows the hand, fear weakens the spirit. But joy makes every movement perfect. Equally important was Jagatai's emphasis on individual excellence within collective action. Unlike the Palatine approach, which subordinated personal initiative to rigid formation tactics, the Khan's method encouraged warriors to develop their unique strengths while learning to coordinate seamlessly with their brothers. The strongest army, he said, is not one that moves as a single body, but one that moves as many bodies with a single mind. Perhaps most distinctive was Jagatai's concept of empty space in warfare. He taught his warriors to recognize that battlefields consisted not merely of where forces were positioned, but where they were absent. Power flows like water, he explained to his commanders. It follows the path of least resistance. Do not strike where the enemy is strongest, strike where he is not. This approach would later evolve into the White Scar's mastery of mobile warfare, exploiting gaps in enemy defenses rather than confronting strongpoints directly. With his confederation firmly established and his tactical doctrine refined, Jaghatai turned his attention to the Palatine Empire. The campaign that followed demonstrated the Primarch's strategic genius. Rather than attempting a frontal assault on the Empire's walled cities, he systematically isolated them by targeting the road network that connected imperial territories. Lightning raids destroyed bridges, collapsed mountain passes, and eliminated patrol outposts. Palatine forces found themselves unable to concentrate, with individual cities effectively cut off from central command. Jaghatai then employed psychological warfare with surgical precision. He would appear without warning at the gates of a city, offering its rulers a choice: surrender with honor and maintain local authority under his overall rule, or face the consequences of resistance. Many chose surrender, having witnessed the fate of those who defied the Khan. Those who resisted found their defenses systematically dismantled, not through crude siege tactics, but through infiltration, sabotage, and the targeted elimination of leadership. The conquest of Palatine's capital, Quanzhou, exemplified Jaghatai's approach. After isolating the city for 3 months, he led a small force of his most elite warriors in a night infiltration, scaling the supposedly unclimbable eastern wall during a thunderstorm. By dawn, the Khan sat on the imperial throne, the emperor and his personal guard dead. The city's population, awakening to find their rulers eliminated, and the Khan's warriors controlling key positions, surrendered without further bloodshed. With the fall of Quanzhou, the remaining Palatine territories capitulated. Within 5 years of beginning his campaign, Jaghatai had accomplished what centuries of tribal warfare had failed to achieve: the complete subjugation of the Palatine Empire. His treatment of the conquered peoples revealed his fundamental difference from typical conquerors. He abolished the oppressive caste system that had defined Palatine society, integrated useful imperial technologies and administrative techniques into his confederation, and appointed rulers based on merit rather than bloodline or wealth. The unified Chogoris that emerged under Jaghatai's leadership represented a unique synthesis of nomadic and settled cultures. The Khan maintained his personal preference for the open steppes, residing in a jur rather than the imperial palace, but he recognized the value of cities as centers of learning, production, and commerce. He established a system of governance that balanced central authority with local autonomy, creating a framework that could function effectively even in his absence. This period of consolidation was interrupted by the arrival of the Emperor of Mankind. Imperial records differ on the exact circumstances of their meeting, but Chogorian oral traditions describe the emperor arriving alone, riding across the steppes to Jaghatai's encampment without escort or announcement. The Primarch, sensing the approach of a being whose power matched or exceeded his own, rode out to meet this stranger. Their initial conversation, conducted on horseback as they rode side by side across the plains, lasted for hours. The emperor explained Jaghatai's true origins, the great crusade to reunify humanity, and the role intended for the Primarchs in this grand endeavor. Jaghatai listened without interruption, his face revealing nothing of his thoughts. When the emperor finished, Jaghatai's response revealed the independence of mind that would characterize his service to the Imperium. "You claim me as a son created for your purpose," he reportedly said, yet I have forged my own path and built my own kingdom. Why should I abandon what I have made to serve your vision? The emperor's answer appealed not to authority but to perspective. He showed Jaghatai visions of the galaxy, countless human worlds struggling in isolation, Xeno's predators circling vulnerable colonies, the achievements of Old Night crumbling into dust. Most importantly, he revealed the existence of Jaghatai's brother Primarchs, each found on a different world, each with their own strengths and perspectives. This last revelation affected Jaghatai deeply. The concept of brothers, equals with whom he could share both fellowship and challenge, appealed to the Khan's nature. After a day of contemplation, he agreed to join the Great Crusade, but with conditions that demonstrated his commitment to Chogoris. His world would maintain its cultural independence, recruitment for his legion would come primarily from the tribes of the steppes, and he would have significant autonomy in how he prosecuted compliance actions. The emperor, recognizing in Jaghatai a valuable combination of martial prowess and independent thinking, accepted these terms. Before departing Chogoris, the Khan established a regency council comprising both tribal leaders and former Palatine administrators, ensuring his unified world would not fragment in his absence. He selected 100 of his finest warriors to accompany him to Terra, where they would form the core of the new White Scars Legion and help integrate the Primarch's tactical doctrines with existing Legion structures. As Jaghatai prepared to leave the world that had shaped him, he addressed his people one final time from the steps of the palace in Quanzhou. "I go to hunt in fields beyond the sky," he told the assembled thousands, "but my spirit remains in the wind that crosses our steppes. I will return when the stars themselves have been conquered." Long before the Great Khan took command of his sons, the 5th Legion fought across the stars with a savagery that earned them both respect and wariness from their brother legions. Created in the gene laboratories of Terra alongside their counterparts, these warriors were not yet the White Scars, nor did they bear the name Star Hunters, as some apocryphal texts suggest. They were simply the 5th Legion, a designation that carried little cultural weight, but would soon become synonymous with speed, precision, and relentless pursuit. The earliest recruits of the 5th Legion came from Terra's Pan-Pacific region, with significant numbers drawn from the Asiatic peoples of the former Indonesian bloc. These warriors brought with them cultural traditions that, while distinct from Chogorian customs, shared certain philosophical underpinnings, particularly a respect for martial prowess and individual skill. The genetic screening process favored candidates with quick reflexes, spatial awareness, and natural aggression, traits that would later complement Jaghatai's tactical doctrines. During the Unification Wars, the 5th Legion operated primarily as shock troops and exploitation forces. After Thunder Warriors or other Legion elements breached enemy lines, the 5th would pour through the gaps, cutting down fleeing opponents and preventing defensive regrouping. This role suited their innate aggression and developing expertise in rapid assault tactics. Unlike some of their brother legions, they rarely held territory or engaged in prolonged sieges, instead moving constantly from conflict to conflict. The Legion's first recorded major engagement came during the Cerberus insurrection, where techno-barbarian forces had seized control of a significant weapons cache in the Caucasus region. While the 7th and 13th Legions engaged the rebels' main force, the 5th circled behind enemy lines and systematically eliminated command posts, supply depots, and communication hubs. When the rebels attempted to retreat to secondary positions, they found their escape routes already under Legion control. The insurrection collapsed within 3 days, with minimal civilian casualties, an early example of the Legion's ability to end conflicts through decisive, targeted action rather than overwhelming force. This pattern continued throughout the Unification Wars. The 5th developed specialized tactics for urban combat, mountain warfare, and desert operations, adapting their approach to each theater while maintaining their focus on mobility and pursuit. Their warriors learned to operate with minimal supply lines, carrying only essential equipment and living off captured resources when necessary. This self-sufficiency allowed them to operate independently for extended periods, often penetrating deep into enemy territory without support. The Legion's command structure during this period was notably decentralized compared to some of their counterparts. While a clear chain of command existed, field officers held significant autonomy, making tactical decisions based on changing battlefield conditions rather than rigid strategic plans. This approach occasionally led to friction with more structured forces, but proved highly effective in the chaotic environments of the Unification Wars. As Terra fell under the Emperor's complete control and the Great Crusade began, the Fifth Legion faced new challenges. Five-oid warfare and planetary assaults required different skills than the ground campaigns of the Unification Wars. The Legion adapted by developing specialized boarding tactics, using their speed and aggression to overwhelm enemy vessels from within rather than engaging in protracted ship-to-ship exchanges. On planetary surfaces, they mastered rapid deployment from orbit, often inserting small teams to disrupt enemy defenses before main assault forces arrived. The early Great Crusade saw the Fifth Legion's reputation for ferocity grow. During the compliance of Kaddish, the Legion faced an entrenched Xeno species whose crystalline technology rendered conventional weapons ineffective. Rather than withdrawing to request specialized equipment, the Legion commander ordered his warriors to engage in close combat, using the aliens' own severed limbs as improvised weapons. The compliance action succeeded, but at heavy cost. Nearly 300 legionaries fell in what some considered an unnecessarily brutal approach. This incident highlighted a concerning trend within the Legion. Without their Primarch's guidance, the Fifth increasingly relied on overwhelming aggression rather than tactical finesse. Their pursuit doctrine evolved from targeted strikes against strategic assets to relentless hunting of any who opposed Imperial compliance. Some expedition fleets began requesting other Legion support for compliance actions, concerned that the Fifth's methods would leave nothing but ashes to integrate into the Imperium. The 8th Expeditionary Fleet, led by Lord Commander Threshold, became particularly notorious for its approach to resistance. After initial diplomatic overtures failed, Threshold would deploy the 5th Legion in a pattern known as the Crimson Tide, simultaneous drops at multiple points surrounding population centers, followed by a systematic contraction that eliminated all armed opposition. While technically effective, this approach made little distinction between military forces and civilian infrastructure, often leaving compliant worlds damaged beyond easy recovery. Despite these concerning developments, the 5th Legion achieved significant successes during this period. Their rapid response capabilities made them particularly effective against orc infestations, where their ability to locate and eliminate leadership elements often prevented larger WA formations from coalescing. The Legion developed specialized anti-orc tactics, including the Headhunter Protocol small kill teams that would bypass frontline combatants to target knobs and warbosses directly. The Legion's internal culture during this pre-Primarch period was notably Spartan. While other legions developed elaborate traditions and rituals, the 5th maintained a utilitarian approach to everything from combat training to living quarters. Their fortress monastery on Terra contained few decorative elements or ceremonial spaces, instead focusing on practical training facilities and armories. This lack of cultural identity would later make the transition to Chogorian customs relatively smooth, as there were few entrenched traditions to displace. One distinctive aspect of the early 5th Legion was their approach to warfare as a craft rather than a science or art. Legion training emphasized practical skills over theoretical knowledge, with warriors learning through direct experience rather than classroom instruction. Veterans would take younger legionaries under their guidance, passing down techniques and tactical insights through demonstration rather than formal teaching. This apprenticeship system created strong bonds between generations of warriors, but limited standardization across the Legion. The 5th Legion's fleet composition reflected their tactical preferences. Rather than centering their operations around massive capital ships, they favored collections of faster vessels, strike cruisers, frigates, and specialized landing craft. This distributed approach allowed them to attack from multiple vectors simultaneously and rapidly redeploy based on battlefield developments. Their flagship during this period, the Swordpoint, was not the largest vessel in the Legion fleet, but was renowned for its advanced maneuvering capabilities and rapid deployment launch bays. Legion recruitment practices evolved significantly during the early Great Crusade. Initial cohorts came exclusively from Terra, But as the Emperor's forces secured more worlds, the Fifth began incorporating warriors from compliant populations. They favored candidates from cultures with strong martial traditions, particularly those with experience in mobile warfare or guerrilla tactics. This diversity of backgrounds brought new perspectives to Legion operations, but also created potential fault lines that would become apparent after Jaghatai's discovery. The Fifth Legion's size remained smaller than many of their counterparts throughout this period. Their aggressive tactics resulted in higher casualty rates, while their selective recruitment practices limited replacement numbers. By the time Jaghatai Khan was discovered, the Legion numbered approximately 70,000 warriors, significant but notably smaller than legions like the Ultramarines or Luna Wolves. This relatively compact size would later prove advantageous as the Khan reshaped the Legion, allowing for more comprehensive implementation of his tactical doctrines. When news reached the scattered elements of the Fifth Legion that their Primarch had been found, reactions varied. Some warriors welcomed the development, hoping that genuine leadership would provide direction and purpose beyond endless war. Others harbored concerns that a Primarch might restrict their operational freedom or impose unwelcome changes to their established methods. A significant contingent, led by Terran-born officers, worried that their positions and influence might diminish under the new command structure. Their concerns were not entirely unfounded. When Jaghatai Khan took control of the Legion, he immediately recognized both its strengths and weaknesses. The speed and aggression that had become the Fifth's hallmarks aligned with his own tactical preferences, but he found their application often lacked subtlety and strategic purpose. "You hunt well," he reportedly told his gathered officers, "but you do not understand the purpose of the hunt." The Khan's first actions established a clear break with past practices. He renamed the Legion the White Scars, adopting the symbol of the lightning bolt that had marked his Chogorian warriors. He restructured the command hierarchy, creating the Brotherhood system that divided the Legion into semi-autonomous formations led by experienced commanders called Khans. Most significantly, he modified recruitment practices to draw heavily from Chogoris, particularly the nomadic tribes of the steppes. This influx of Chogorian warriors accelerated the cultural transformation of the Legion. The new recruits brought with them not just fighting skills, but an entire philosophical framework, the traditions, spiritual practices, and social structures of the steppes. They introduced ritual scarification, tribal markings on armor, and the practice of naming weapons and vehicles. Most significantly, they brought the tradition of the Stormseers, psychers trained in the shamanic practices of Chogoris, who combined the roles of librarian, spiritual guide, and tactical advisor. The integration of these new elements created inevitable tensions within the Legion. Many Terran veterans viewed the Chogorian customs with suspicion or outright hostility, considering them primitive superstitions incompatible with the imperial truth. The practice of ritual scarification particularly troubled some officers, who saw it as unnecessary mutilation rather than meaningful tradition. These concerns were often expressed privately rather than through formal channels, creating an undercurrent of discontent beneath the Legion's surface unity. Jaghatai recognized these tensions, but addressed them with characteristic subtlety. Rather than forcing immediate compliance with Chogorian customs, he allowed a period of cultural exchange and gradual integration. He paired Terran veterans with Chogorian warriors in mixed units, ensuring both groups learned from each other's strengths. He maintained many effective Terran officers in leadership positions, while gradually promoting talented Chogorians to create a balanced command structure. Most effectively, the Khan demonstrated the practical value of Chogorian approaches through battlefield success. Under his leadership, the Legion refined its pursuit doctrine into a sophisticated system of mobile warfare that maintained the aggression of earlier approaches while adding strategic purpose and tactical flexibility. Early victories under this new system convinced many skeptical veterans that the cultural changes brought tangible benefits to Legion operations. The Brotherhood system proved particularly successful in bridging the cultural divide. By creating smaller, semi-autonomous units with their own identities and traditions, Jaghatai allowed space for both Terran and Chogorian customs to coexist within the broader Legion structure. Some brotherhoods maintained predominantly Terran practices, others embraced Chogorian ways, and many developed unique syntheses of both traditions. This diversity within unity became a defining characteristic of the White Scars, distinguishing them from more homogeneous legions. The White Scars' approach to warfare represented a fundamental departure from the tactics employed by many of their brother legions. While the Imperial Fists fortified positions and the Ultramarines executed precise battlefield maneuvers, the 5th Legion perfected what Imperial strategists would later term lightning warfare, a doctrine that emphasized overwhelming speed, devastating surprise attacks, and the psychological impact of appearing seemingly everywhere at once. At the heart of this tactical philosophy lay the White Scars' distinctive approach to armored warfare. Unlike the Iron Warriors, who deployed tanks in massed formations to overwhelm enemy positions through concentrated firepower, Jaghatai's sons utilized their vehicles with a fluidity that bewildered opponents. Squadrons of rhinos and land speeders would emerge from unexpected vectors, strike vulnerable targets, and vanish before effective countermeasures could be implemented. This approach earned them the nickname, the Storm, among Imperial Army regiments who fought alongside them, appearing with sudden fury and disappearing just as quickly. The Legion's mechanized forces underwent extensive modification under Jaghatai's direction. Standard Rhino transports received upgraded suspension systems, reinforced drive trains, and enhanced inertial dampeners that allowed them to traverse broken terrain at speeds that would have crippled unmodified vehicles. Their Predator tanks sacrificed some armor protection for increased mobility, featuring reconfigured engine blocks that delivered superior acceleration and maneuverability. Even their dreadnoughts were adapted for the Legion's warfare style, with additional servo motors and hydraulic systems that allowed these walking sarcophagi to keep pace with mounted formations. Most iconic among the White Scars' vehicular adaptations were their jet bikes. These anti-gravity assault platforms had been part of Astartes' arsenal since the early Great Crusade, but in the hands of the 5th Legion, they became signature weapons of war. Chogorian recruits, raised riding the swift horses of their homeworld steppes, adapted naturally to these machines, handling them with an intuitive grace that amazed even veteran riders from other legions. Legion Techmarines modified standard patterns with additional stabilizers, enhanced turbine intakes, and custom-designed control interfaces that responded to the slightest pressure from their riders. The White Scars jetbike squadrons operated in formations called Brotherhoods of the Hunt, typically comprising 5 to 15 riders under the command of a veteran hunt master. These units employed sophisticated pack tactics derived from Chogorian hunting traditions, surrounding targets in dynamic patterns that left no avenue of escape. A common maneuver, known as the Karash, involved 3 riders approaching from different angles, forcing the enemy to divide their attention while a 4th struck from a blind spot. Against infantry formations, jetbike squadrons would execute the Falling Lightning attack, a high-speed pass that scattered enemy ranks, followed by precise follow-up strikes against isolated groups. Beyond their vehicles, the White Scars' arsenal featured weapons specifically suited to their mobile warfare doctrine. The most distinctive was the Power Lance, a modified power weapon that channeled energy fields through a reinforced shaft tipped with a molecular-edged blade. When wielded from the back of a charging jetbike, these weapons delivered impacts that could penetrate even Terminator armor. The moment of impact was carefully calculated, with riders activating the power field microseconds before contact to maximize penetration while conserving energy. Complementing these were the traditional Chogorian tulwar, curved power swords designed for slashing attacks delivered at speed. Unlike the straight blades favored by many legions, the tulwar's curved edge allowed for more effective cutting motions when striking from a moving platform. Master weaponsmiths on Chogoris forged these blades using ancient techniques, folding the metal thousands of times before Legion Techmarines added power field generators and energy conduits. Each weapon was uniquely balanced for its wielder, becoming an extension of the Astartes arm rather than merely a tool. For ranged combat, the Legion favored weapons that could be effectively employed while on the move. Bolt pistols with custom targeting arrays allowed for accurate fire from the back of speeding vehicles, while specialized bolters featured modified stocks and stabilization systems that compensated for the motion of their platforms. Many White Scars also carried the Dao, a compact carbine-sized bolter that sacrificed some range and stopping power for improved handling characteristics during mobile operations. The White Scars' tactical doctrine, formalized by Jaghatai as the Way of the Heaven Storm, emphasized 5 key principles that guided their approach to warfare. First was the swift hand, the concept that speed itself was a weapon, allowing the Legion to seize initiative and maintain it through constant movement. Second came the empty field, the practice of avoiding enemy strengths while exploiting gaps in their defenses. Third was the hunting kite, the use of feigned retreat to draw enemies into disadvantageous positions. Fourth stood the lightning's return, devastating counterattacks launched at the precise moment when enemies overextended themselves. The final principle, the storm's heart, emphasized the importance of precision strikes against command elements, supply lines, and other critical vulnerabilities. These principles manifested in battlefield tactics that confounded enemies accustomed to more conventional warfare. A typical White Scars engagement began with reconnaissance by small jetbike teams operating far ahead of main forces, identifying enemy dispositions and vulnerabilities. This intelligence would inform the deployment of strike forces, which approached from multiple vectors simultaneously, often using terrain features to mask their approach until the last possible moment. Initial contact typically featured a feigned main assault that drew enemy attention and resources, while secondary forces moved into position for the actual decisive strike. When faced with superior numbers, the White Scars excelled at the tactical withdrawal, not a retreat in the conventional sense, but a carefully orchestrated movement designed to fragment enemy formations and draw them into prepared killing zones. These maneuvers required exceptional coordination and battlefield awareness, with unit commanders making split-second decisions based on rapidly evolving situations rather than rigid battle plans. The Legion's emphasis on mobility extended to their logistical operations. White Scars' expeditionary forces traveled light, carrying minimal supplies and relying on rapid resupply operations rather than established supply lines. Their tech marines became adept at field repairs using limited resources, often cannibalizing damaged vehicles to keep others operational. This approach allowed the Legion to operate independently for extended periods in hostile territory, striking far beyond the reach of conventional forces. Within the Legion's organizational structure, the Brotherhood system replaced the traditional company arrangement found in most legions. Each Brotherhood functioned as a self-contained battle group with its own command structure, support elements, and combat doctrine. A typical Brotherhood comprised between 70 and 100 Astartes, divided into smaller units called lances. This decentralized approach allowed for greater tactical flexibility, with Brotherhood Khans exercising considerable autonomy in how they executed overall strategic objectives. The elite of the White Scars fighting force was the Keshig, the personal honor guard of Jaghatai Khan and his most trusted commanders. Selection for the Keshig came not through formal competition, but through recognition of exceptional skill, courage, and judgment demonstrated in battle. These warriors received additional training in close protection techniques and specialized equipment, including artificer armor inscribed with ancient Chogorian runes and master-crafted weapons. The Keshig operated not merely as bodyguards, but as shock troops deployed at critical junctures where their superior skill could turn the tide of battle. Complementing the Keshig were the Stormseers, the Legion's librarians whose psychic abilities were shaped by the shamanic traditions of Chogoris. Unlike the more analytical approach to psychic power found in legions like the Thousand Suns, Stormseers viewed their abilities through a spiritual lens, seeing themselves as conduits for natural forces rather than masters of arcane energies. Their combat techniques reflected this philosophy, with powers manifesting as lightning strikes, sudden gusts of wind that knocked enemies from their feet, or localized storms that reduced visibility for all except their battle brothers. The Stormseers served multiple roles within the Legion structure. In battle, they provided both offensive psychic support and crucial battlefield intelligence, using their abilities to sense enemy movements and intentions. Between engagements, they preserved the Legion's oral traditions through ritual storytelling and maintained the spiritual well-being of their brothers. Their most important function, however, was identifying and neutralizing warp-based threats before they could corrupt the Legion, a role that would prove crucial during the later heresy. When implementing their tactical doctrine against different opponents, the White Scars demonstrated remarkable adaptability. Against orcs, they exploited the greenskins' lack of cohesion when separated from their leaders, using rapid strikes to isolate and eliminate warbosses and knobs before dealing with the remaining forces. Eldar proved more challenging, their own speed and foresight sometimes countering the Legion's mobility advantage, but the White Scars developed techniques to overwhelm Eldar's sensory capabilities through unpredictable attack patterns and deliberate psychic masking by their Stormseers. Human opponents, whether rebellious Imperial worlds or uncontacted civilizations, often found themselves psychologically devastated by White Scars tactics before significant physical damage occurred. The Legion would demonstrate their ability to strike anywhere at will, targeting symbolic locations and leadership compounds, while leaving civilian infrastructure largely intact. This approach often led to rapid capitulation, as planetary leaders realized the futility of conventional defense against such mobile opponents. The effectiveness of the White Scars approach was perhaps best demonstrated during the Kondax campaign, where the Legion was tasked with eliminating a significant orc presence that threatened newly compliant human worlds. Rather than engaging the greenskins in direct confrontation as the orcs expected, Jaghatai deployed his forces in a complex series of encircling maneuvers that isolated orc concentrations from each other. Strike forces would appear from unexpected directions, destroy key infrastructure and leadership elements, then withdraw before reinforcements could arrive. Throughout this campaign, the Legion employed their signature feigned retreat tactic with devastating effect. Seemingly vulnerable White Scars units would allow themselves to be discovered by orc forces, then withdraw in apparent disorder, drawing the greenskins into carefully prepared ambush zones where concentrated firepower could be brought to bear. After several such encounters, the orcs became hesitant to pursue retreating White Scars, effectively neutralizing one of the greenskins' primary advantages, their aggressive pursuit instinct. The Legion's approach to void warfare reflected the same principles that guided their ground operations. Their fleet, comprising predominantly lighter, faster vessels rather than massive battleships, excelled at hit-and-run attacks that targeted propulsion systems and weapons batteries. White Scars boarding actions were particularly feared, with assault teams breaching enemy vessels at multiple points simultaneously, overwhelming internal defenses through speed and coordination rather than brute force. Training for this distinctive style of warfare began immediately upon a recruit's induction into the Legion. After receiving their gene seed implants and basic Astartes conditioning, neophytes underwent what the Legion called the First Ride, an extended period of training focused exclusively on mastering various vehicles and mounts. Only after demonstrating proficiency in mounted combat would they receive instruction in other aspects of Astartes warfare, reversing the typical training sequence found in most legions. This specialized training continued throughout a White Scars Astartes career. Veterans regularly participated in exercises designed to hone their mounted combat skills, including the Hunt of the 10,000 Steps, a competition that required participants to track and capture designated targets across thousands of kilometers of varied terrain while evading hunter-killer teams. These exercises emphasized not just speed, but judgment, requiring warriors to make constant decisions about when to advance, when to withdraw, and how to adapt to changing circumstances. The White Scars' mastery of swift warfare earned them both admiration and suspicion from their brother legions. The Space Wolves respected their prowess as hunters, while the Raven Guard found common ground in their appreciation for mobility and surprise. The Iron Warriors and Imperial Fists, however, often dismissed White Scars' tactics as lacking substance, viewing their hit-and-run approach as an avoidance of real combat. Such criticisms missed the fundamental effectiveness of the Legion's doctrine, which achieved strategic objectives while minimizing casualties through intelligent application of force rather than overwhelming power. The White Scars' organizational structure stood apart from their brother legions in ways that reflected both their Chogorian heritage and Jaghatai Khan's philosophy of warfare. While other legions organized themselves into companies of standardized size and function, the 5th Legion adopted a more fluid approach based on the tribal confederations of their Primarch's homeworld. This system, known as the Brotherhood or Orda, became the fundamental building block of White Scars' military operations and cultural identity. Each Brotherhood functioned as a semi-autonomous combat formation, typically numbering between 70 and 150 Astartes depending on its specific role and the campaigns it had recently undertaken. Unlike the rigid 100-man companies of Guilliman's Ultramarines or Dorn's Imperial Fists, Brotherhood strength fluctuated organically based on battlefield losses, recruitment patterns, and operational requirements. This flexibility allowed the White Scars to adapt their organization to changing circumstances without disrupting their command structure or tactical doctrine. The Brotherhoods were not merely administrative divisions, but living communities with distinct identities, traditions, and fighting styles. Each bore a name that carried significance in Chogorian culture: the Brotherhood of the Storm, the Brotherhood of the Eagle, the Brotherhood of the Moon, names that evoked natural forces or totemic animals revered by the steppe tribes. These names were not merely symbolic, but reflected the Brotherhood's approach to warfare. The Brotherhood of the Lightning Strike specialized in sudden, overwhelming assaults against key targets, while the Brotherhood of the Burning Wind excelled at encirclement tactics and area denial operations. At the head of each Brotherhood stood the Noyan Khan, a position that combined the roles of military commander, spiritual leader, and cultural guardian. Selected not merely for tactical acumen, but for their embodiment of White Scars' values, these officers exercised authority that extended beyond the battlefield into all aspects of their warriors' lives. Noyan Khan's responsibilities included overseeing training regimens, resolving internal disputes, maintaining cultural traditions, and serving as the Brotherhood's representative in Legion councils. The relationship between Noyan Khan's and Jaghatai himself differed significantly from the command structures of other legions. While Primarchs like Guilliman or Dorn maintained tight control over their officers through detailed protocols and frequent oversight, the Great Khan granted his Brotherhood commanders substantial autonomy. He provided strategic direction and overall objectives, but left the specifics of implementation to their judgment. This approach reflected the Chogorian principle of strength through independence, the belief that warriors fought most effectively when given freedom to apply their skills according to circumstance rather than rigid doctrine. This autonomy extended to recruitment and training practices. Each Brotherhood maintained its own traditions for selecting and preparing new Astartes, resulting in subtle but significant variations across the Legion. The Brotherhood of the Black Plain favored candidates from Chogoris' southern steppes, known for their exceptional marksmanship, while the Brotherhood of the Kum River drew heavily from the mountain tribes, whose natural endurance made them ideal for extended operations in harsh environments. These regional preferences created distinctive combat styles within the broader Legion doctrine, adding layers of unpredictability that confounded enemies expecting standardized tactics. Training within each Brotherhood combined standardized Astartes, conditioning with practices drawn from Chogorian culture. New recruits learned not only how to operate bolters and pilot vehicles, but how to track prey across barren landscapes, read weather patterns for tactical advantage, and maintain their equipment under primitive conditions. Senior members passed down oral histories of notable campaigns, ensuring that tactical lessons learned through experience were preserved and transmitted to new generations of warriors. The internal structure of a Brotherhood reflected the tribal organization of Chogorian nomads. Warriors were grouped into Zuns and Arbans, with each formation led by experienced veterans who had demonstrated both combat prowess and leadership ability. These smaller units maintained close bonds forged through shared training, combat experience, and ritual activities. Arban members typically ate together, trained together, and fought in close proximity during engagements, developing the intuitive understanding of each other's movements and intentions that allowed for complex maneuvers without explicit communication. This emphasis on small unit cohesion proved particularly valuable during the extended campaigns of the Great Crusade, where brotherhoods often operated independently for years at a time, beyond regular communication with Legion command. The strong internal bonds within Arbans and Zunes provided stability and continuity, even when isolated from the broader Legion structure, allowing White Scar's forces to maintain their effectiveness despite extended deployments in hostile territory. Central to the Brotherhood system was the concept of Jaga, the bond between warriors who had shed blood together. Unlike the formalized battle brotherhood of legions like the Blood Angels or Space Wolves, Jaga represented a deeply personal connection formed through shared hardship and mutual reliance in combat. Warriors who had established Jaga could anticipate each other's actions in battle, compensate for each other's weaknesses, and communicate complex tactical intentions through subtle gestures or expressions. This bond transcended rank and position. A veteran could form Jaga with a relatively new Astartes if their combat styles complemented each other effectively. The formation of Jaga bonds was marked by ritual scarification, with warriors exchanging blood and adding matching marks to their bodies after particularly significant battles. These scars formed a physical record of a warrior's combat history and relationships, readable to other White Scars but incomprehensible to outsiders. A veteran's body thus became a living document of his service, with each mark representing not just participation in a campaign, but the specific brothers with whom he had formed connections during that conflict. While the Brotherhood system provided substantial autonomy, it required mechanisms to ensure coordination across the Legion. This function fell to the Kurultai periodic gatherings of all Noyan Khans under the leadership of Jaghatai himself. During these councils, Brotherhood commanders shared intelligence, coordinated future operations, resolved disputes, and received strategic direction from the Primarch. The Kurultai typically took place on Chogoris or aboard the Primarch's flagship, the Swordstorm, and could last anywhere from several days to several weeks, depending on the complexity of issues under discussion. The proceedings of the Kurultai followed ancient Chogorian traditions. Each Noyan Khan presented reports on their Brotherhood's activities since the previous gathering, highlighting notable victories, significant casualties, and lessons learned. Strategic debates unfolded according to formalized protocols, with speakers indicating their intention to contribute by standing and placing their weapons before them on the ground as a symbol of peaceful intent. The Great Khan typically spoke last, after hearing all perspectives, providing direction that synthesized the wisdom of his commanders with his own strategic vision. Between these formal gatherings, coordination between brotherhoods relied on a sophisticated system of oath-sworn messengers called Keshig Arban. These elite warriors, selected for both combat prowess and absolute reliability, carried communications between scattered Legion elements across vast distances. Their augmented memories allowed them to transport complex messages without written documentation, while their combat skills ensured they could fight through opposition to deliver critical intelligence. The position of Keshig Arban carried tremendous prestige within the Legion, with successful messengers often rising to leadership positions after completing their service. The autonomy granted to brotherhoods occasionally created tensions, with imperial authorities unaccustomed to such decentralized command structures. Compliance actions conducted by White Scar's forces sometimes deviated from standard protocols, with Noyan Khans adapting their approach based on local conditions rather than following predetermined templates. While these adaptations typically improved outcomes, they frustrated imperial administrators who preferred predictable processes and clear chains of command. Several brotherhoods developed reputations for particularly independent interpretation of imperial directives, including the Brotherhood of the Red Earth, whose commander once famously told an imperial governor that the emperors will reach us through the Great Khan, not through your papers. Despite these occasional frictions, the Brotherhood system proved remarkably effective at maintaining Legion cohesion across vast distances. White Scar's forces deployed throughout the galaxy maintained consistent cultural practices and tactical approaches despite minimal central oversight, a testament to the strength of their shared identity and values. When brotherhoods that had been separated for decades reunited during major campaigns, they could integrate their operations seamlessly, recognizing in each other the fundamental principles that define the Legion despite superficial variations in equipment or terminology. The personal honor that bound these disparate elements together represented perhaps the most significant aspect of White Scar's culture. Unlike the abstract concepts of duty that motivated legions like the Ultramarines or Imperial Fists, White Scar's warriors understood honor as something deeply personal, a reflection of individual character rather than adherence to external standards. A warrior's worth was measured not by his compliance with regulations, but by his adherence to the principles of courage, honesty, and loyalty to his brothers. This concept of honor manifested in the practice of naming weapons and vehicles, bestowing identity upon tools of war to acknowledge their role in maintaining a warrior's reputation. A White Scar's Astartes might carry a chainsword named Truth Speaker, or ride a jet bike called Wind's Daughter, treating these items not as mere equipment, but as extensions of his identity and participants in his achievements. These names were not assigned casually, but earned through notable actions. A bolter might receive its name only after contributing to a particularly significant victory, while a vehicle's designation might change to reflect evolving patterns of use or exceptional performance in specific circumstances. The relationship between Noyan Khans and the Great Khan himself reflected the perfect balance of autonomy and unity that characterized the Legion. Jaghatai did not demand the unquestioning obedience that some Primarchs expected, nor did he maintain the distant formality that others preferred. Instead, he established relationships based on mutual respect and shared purpose, recognizing the unique strengths and perspectives that each Brotherhood commander brought to the Legion. During Kurultai gatherings, he encouraged open debate and genuine disagreement, believing that the best strategies emerged from the clash of different viewpoints rather than unchallenged authority. This approach created a command structure remarkably resistant to the personality conflicts that plagued some legions. White Scar's officers learned to separate substantive tactical disagreements from personal animosity, engaging in vigorous debate without undermining the fundamental bonds of brotherhood. When a decision was reached, whether through consensus or the Great Khan's intervention, all parties committed to its implementation, regardless of their position during discussions. This mature approach to leadership allowed the Legion to benefit from diverse perspectives while maintaining operational unity. The effectiveness of the Brotherhood system became particularly evident during extended campaigns, where White Scar's forces operated beyond regular communication with Legion command. During the Kondak's Crusade, 5 separate Brotherhoods coordinated their operations across an entire sector without direct oversight from Jaghatai, maintaining strategic coherence through shared understanding of Legion doctrine rather than explicit direction. When communication was finally reestablished, the Primarch found that his commanders had not merely executed their assigned objectives, but had adapted to changing circumstances in ways that anticipated his own strategic adjustments. This combination of independence and cohesion made the White Scars particularly effective against enemies that relied on disrupting command structures. Attempts to isolate and eliminate Brotherhood leadership typically failed to degrade overall combat effectiveness, as Zune and Arban commanders seamlessly assumed higher responsibilities based on established succession protocols. Even when successful, such decapitation strikes merely transformed White Scars operations from coordinated campaigns to distributed guerrilla actions, a change that often proved more problematic for enemies than the original approach. The Brotherhood system's resilience derived not just from its formal structures, but from the cultural practices that reinforced its underlying values. Ritual storytelling sessions, known as the Speaking of Names, preserved the Legion's history and tactical wisdom through oral tradition rather than written records. During these gatherings, warriors would recount notable battles, honoring fallen brothers and extracting lessons from both victories and defeats. These narratives were not mere entertainment, but served as training tools, transmitting combat techniques and strategic insights through vivid, memorable accounts that new warriors could internalize more effectively than formal tactical manuals. The Kondax campaign had drawn the White Scars far from the heart of the Imperium when the first tremors of betrayal began to shake the foundations of mankind's stellar empire. While Horus unleashed his treachery at Istvan, Jaghatai Khan and his warriors remained engaged in a protracted operation against greenskin forces in a distant star system, methodically eliminating Orc strongholds with their characteristic precision and speed. This physical isolation would soon be mirrored by an informational quarantine that left the 5th Legion in a state of dangerous uncertainty about the wider galactic conflict. Initial reports of the War Master's rebellion reached the White Scars through fragmented astropathic communications, their meaning obscured by warp disturbances and contradictory accounts. Some messages claimed that Horus had turned against the Emperor. Others insisted that the Space Wolves had attacked the Thousand Suns without provocation. Still others suggested that multiple Primarchs had fallen to madness or Xeno's influence. The information vacuum created fertile ground for confusion and manipulation, particularly among Legion elements with pre-existing grievances or divided loyalties. This confusion was deliberately exacerbated by Horus's agents, who had infiltrated communication networks throughout the Imperium. Doctored astropathic transmissions reached Jaghatai's fleet, presenting carefully crafted narratives that portrayed the Emperor as having abandoned the Great Crusade in favor of godhood, while depicting Horus as the true defender of the imperial truth. These false messages included fabricated evidence of the Emperor's supposed betrayal of his original vision, designed to prey upon the Khan's known frustrations with imperial bureaucracy and restrictions on Legion autonomy. Within the White Scars, these conflicting reports catalyzed a dangerous division that had been simmering beneath the surface since the Legion's formation. The Terran-born officers, many of whom had served since before Jaghatai's discovery, maintained stronger connections to the wider Imperium and generally favored supporting established imperial authority. In contrast, many Chogorian officers viewed their primary loyalty as being to their Primarch rather than distant Terra, and were more inclined to follow Jaghatai's lead regardless of which side he chose in the emerging conflict. This division manifested most visibly in a confrontation between two senior officers, Torgun Khan, commander of the Legion's Terran contingent, and Qin Za, the Primarch's senior bodyguard and combat instructor. When Torgun suggested that the Legion should immediately move to support Horus, based on his status as Imperial War Master, Qin Za countered that no action should be taken until Jaghatai himself had determined the truth of the situation. The exchange grew heated, with Torgun accusing Chogorian officers of blind loyalty to their homeworld traditions over imperial unity, while Qin Za questioned whether some Terran elements harbored resentment over their diminished influence within the Legion. This confrontation did not immediately escalate to violence, but it marked the beginning of a dangerous factional alignment within the Legion. Terran officers began holding separate councils, ostensibly to discuss contingency plans, but increasingly to coordinate their response should the Khan choose a path they considered incorrect. Similarly, Chogorian commanders strengthened their internal networks, preparing to support their Primarch regardless of his decision. This polarization created a volatile situation that threatened to fracture the Legion's unity of purpose at the moment when it was most needed. Jaghatai himself remained outwardly inscrutable during this period of uncertainty. The Great Khan sequestered himself for long periods of meditation, emerging only to request additional intelligence or to consult with his most trusted advisors. He ordered increased reconnaissance activities throughout the region, dispatching small, fast-moving scout vessels to gather information independent of potentially compromised official channels. These efforts yielded fragmentary insights, but no definitive picture of the galactic situation, leaving the Khan to piece together reality from contradictory reports and limited data. The turning point came through an unexpected channel. As Jaghatai meditated in his private chambers aboard the Swordstorm, he experienced what Legion records describe as a storm of the soul, a psychic visitation from his brother Primarch Magnus the Red. This astral projection allowed Magnus to communicate with Jaghatai despite the vast distances separating them physically. The exact content of their exchange remains unknown to all but the Khan himself, but subsequent events suggest that Magnus provided crucial information about Horus's betrayal and the true nature of the forces the War Master had aligned himself with. This psychic meeting carried particular significance given the relationship between the two Primarchs. Despite their different approaches to warfare and governance, Jaghatai and Magnus had maintained a relationship of mutual respect unusual among the often competitive brotherhood of Primarchs. Both valued knowledge and philosophical inquiry, though they pursued these interests through different methods, Magnus through academic study and psychic exploration, Jaghatai through direct experience and meditative contemplation. This existing rapport likely gave Magnus's warnings greater credibility in the Khan's estimation than they might otherwise have received. The conversation appears to have covered not just immediate tactical information about Horus's rebellion, but deeper questions about the nature of the warp and the Emperor's plans. Magnus, having already suffered the consequences of his own psychic investigations, warned Jaghatai about the dangers lurking beyond the veil of reality, entities that had corrupted Horus and sought to use the Primarchs as weapons against humanity. He also shared his perspective on the Emperor's true intentions regarding the Primarchs and the future of psychic humanity, revealing aspects of the Imperial project that had been kept hidden even from the Emperor's sons. This exchange left Jaghatai with much to contemplate. Unlike some of his brothers who made decisions based primarily on loyalty or ambition, the Khan approached the choice before him as a philosophical problem requiring careful consideration. He weighed his long-standing frustrations with imperial policies against his deeper understanding of the Emperor's vision for humanity. He considered his obligations to his legion, to his homeworld, and to mankind as a whole. Most significantly, he examined the nature of the forces that had turned Horus against the Imperium, recognizing in them a fundamental threat to human freedom and self-determination, values the White Scars held sacred. While the Khan deliberated, the division within his legion approached a breaking point. Torgun Khan and his faction had begun making concrete preparations to separate a portion of the Legion fleet and depart for the Istvan system, ostensibly to clarify the situation, but effectively to place themselves under Horus's command. Learning of these plans, Chinza and his loyalists prepared to prevent any such departure by force if necessary. The Legion stood on the brink of internal conflict that would have mirrored the larger civil war engulfing the Imperium. Before this tension could erupt into open violence, Jaghatai emerged from his meditation and summoned all Brotherhood commanders to the great assembly hall of the Swordstorm. The gathering had the formal structure of a traditional Kurultai, but with an atmosphere of unprecedented gravity. Warriors entered the hall with hands on weapons, eyeing former brothers with suspicion. The Legion's unity, maintained through decades of campaign and combat, hung by a thread as they awaited their Primarch's words. Jaghatai's address to his commanders was characteristically direct. He acknowledged the conflicting information they had received and the legitimate questions it raised about the future direction of the Imperium. He spoke of his own doubts about certain imperial policies and his frustrations with the bureaucratic structures that had begun to constrain the Great Crusade. These admissions resonated with many present, particularly those who harbored similar concerns about the evolution of the Imperium away from its original purpose. However, the Khan then pivoted to the fundamental question at hand, not whether the Imperium was flawed, but whether Horus's rebellion represented a legitimate response to those flaws. Drawing on the information received from Magnus and his own analysis of available intelligence, Jaghatai described the influence of warp entities on the War Master's decision-making and the atrocities already committed by rebel forces. He characterized Horus's actions not as a principled stand against imperial overreach, but as a fundamental betrayal of the Brotherhood of Primarchs and the human future they had been created to secure. Most significantly, the Khan framed his decision not as a choice between the Emperor and Horus, but as a choice between human freedom and enslavement to entities from beyond reality. The forces that had corrupted Horus, he explained, sought not to liberate humanity from imperial restrictions, but to subjugate mankind to their own alien purposes. Whatever flaws existed in the Emperor's vision, it remained fundamentally human in its orientation and objectives. The alternative offered by Horus and his new allies represented something altogether different: the subordination of human destiny to inhuman powers. This framing resonated even with those who had been leaning toward Horus's cause. The White Scars, whether of Terran or Chogorian origin, valued independence and self-determination above almost all else. The prospect of exchanging the Emperor's authority for servitude to warp entities struck at the core of their cultural identity. Even Jaghatai Khan, who had been most vocal in questioning the Legion's loyalty to Terra, found his position undermined by this characterization of the choice before them. Jaghatai concluded his address with a clear declaration of intent. The White Scars would remain loyal to the Emperor, not out of blind obedience or unquestioning faith, but because that path best preserved the possibility of human freedom and self-determination. They would fight not for the Imperium as an institution, but for mankind's right to chart its own course, without interference from either bureaucratic overreach or warp-born corruption. This nuanced position acknowledged the legitimate concerns of those who questioned imperial authority while rejecting the false solution offered by Horus. The Khan's decision did not immediately resolve all tensions within the Legion. Torgun and several other Terran officers remained skeptical of the information provided by Magnus, viewing it as potentially self-serving or misleading. These doubters did not openly defy Jaghatai's declaration, but maintained a degree of reservation about committing fully to the loyalist cause. Their hesitation created a lingering undercurrent of uncertainty that would complicate the Legion's operations in the early stages of their response to the heresy. To address this persistent division, Jaghatai implemented a reorganization of Legion command structures. He integrated Terran and Chogorian officers within mixed Brotherhood leadership teams, breaking up concentrations of potentially dissident elements while creating opportunities for mutual understanding between the different factions. He assigned Jaghatai Khan to coordinate closely with Qin Za on fleet security operations, forcing the two rivals to work together toward common objectives. These measures did not eliminate the underlying tensions, but prevented them from coalescing into organized resistance to the Khan's authority. With his Legion's course decided, Jaghatai turned his attention to the strategic situation. The White Scars found themselves in a precarious position, distant from Terra, with uncertain information about which forces remained loyal and which had turned traitor, and potentially surrounded by hostile elements. The Khan recognized that simply rushing toward Terra might lead them into traps or ambushes prepared by traitor forces. Instead, he ordered a measured withdrawal from the Kondak system, maintaining combat readiness while gathering additional intelligence about the wider conflict. This cautious approach proved prescient when the Legion encountered an Alpha Legion fleet near the Kondak system's Manville point. The Alpha Legion claimed to be loyal to the Emperor and attempted to convince Jaghatai to join their operations against purported traitor forces in a nearby sector. However, the Khan's suspicions were aroused by inconsistencies in their account and their unusual eagerness to separate the White Scars from their intended course. A tense standoff ensued, with both fleets maintaining combat posture while their commanders exchanged increasingly pointed communications. The situation resolved when White Scar scout vessels detected additional Alpha Legion ships moving into blocking positions around the system's exit points, a clear indication that their stated intentions were false. Without waiting for further confirmation, Jaghatai ordered an immediate breakthrough operation. The White Scars fleet executed a complex series of maneuvers that scattered the Alpha Legion's formation, creating gaps through which their faster vessels could escape. The ensuing Void battle demonstrated the 5th Legion's mastery of mobile warfare in space, as well as on planetary surfaces, with White Scars ships executing rapid course changes and coordinated attack patterns that left their opponents unable to establish effective firing solutions. This encounter removed any remaining doubts about the reality of the situation. The Alpha Legion's attempted deception and subsequent aggression confirmed that multiple legions had indeed turned against the Emperor, validating Magnus's warnings and the Khan's decision to remain loyal. Even Jaghatai Khan, who had been among the most skeptical of the reports of Astartes turning against Astartes, could no longer deny the evidence before him. The Legion's internal divisions began to heal as they faced the shared external threat posed by the traitors. The journey to Terra tested the White Scar's legendary speed and tactical acumen as never before. After breaking through the Alpha Legion's blockade at Kondax, Jaghatai Khan faced the daunting challenge of navigating his fleet across a galaxy in flames. Traitor forces had established numerous interdiction points along major warp routes, creating a labyrinthine obstacle course designed to delay or destroy loyalist reinforcements heading toward the throne world. Rather than attempting to force passage through these heavily defended corridors, the Khan opted for a characteristically unconventional approach. He divided his fleet into multiple smaller task forces, each taking different paths through lesser-known warp routes and meeting at predetermined rendezvous points. This dispersed formation presented less attractive targets for traitor interception, while allowing the White Scars to gather intelligence across a wider area as they progressed. The Legion's Stormseers proved invaluable during this phase of the journey. Their unique shamanic approach to warp navigation, honed through Chogorian spiritual traditions, allowed them to sense disturbances and dangers that might have eluded more conventionally trained navigators. Several Brotherhood fleets successfully traversed warp passages considered too dangerous for standard Imperial vessels, emerging in unexpected locations that bypassed traitor strongpoints entirely. Aboard the flagship Swordstorm, Jaghatai maintained constant communication with his scattered forces through a network of astropathic relays and fast courier vessels. Each successful rendezvous strengthened the growing armada as Brotherhood after Brotherhood rejoined the main fleet. The Khan personally debriefed each arriving commander, building a comprehensive picture of traitor deployments and loyalist holdouts across the sectors they traversed. This intelligence revealed a disturbing pattern. Horus had positioned significant forces specifically to intercept the White Scars. The traitor Warmaster clearly understood the strategic threat posed by the 5th Legion's arrival at Terra, recognizing that their mobility and strike capability would significantly bolster the Imperial Palace's defenses. Multiple traitor formations had been tasked with ensuring the Khan never reached the throne world. The most formidable of these blocking forces awaited in the Catalyst system, a combined fleet of Death Guard and Sons of Horus vessels arrayed in a defensive formation designed to funnel approaching ships into overlapping fields of fire. Long-range auger scans indicated at least 3 battle barges supported by numerous strike cruisers and escort vessels, a force that outgunned the White Scars fleet by a considerable margin. Faced with this obstacle, many commanders would have sought alternative routes or attempted to force passage through sheer determination and acceptance of heavy losses. Jaghatai chose neither option. Instead, he implemented a strategy that transformed the White Scar's apparent disadvantage into a decisive edge. The Khan ordered his fleet to approach the Catalyst blockade at maximum speed, maintaining tight formation, as if intending a direct breakthrough attempt. This aggressive advance prompted the traitor vessels to adjust their positioning, concentrating their firepower to meet the expected frontal assault. At the precise moment when the enemy formation had committed to this defensive posture, the White Scars fleet executed what would later be recorded in Imperial naval texts as the scattering of the storm. On a synchronized signal, every White Scars vessel simultaneously altered course in different directions, transitioning from a concentrated spear point into an expanding sphere of individual attack vectors. The carefully maintained formation dissolved into apparent chaos as ships accelerated along seemingly random trajectories. This sudden dispersal confused traitor targeting systems and command protocols, creating momentary hesitation among enemy captains uncertain which threats to prioritize. The Khan had transformed a naval engagement into a swirling melee, more reminiscent of steppe warfare than void combat. White Scars strike cruisers darted between lumbering traitor capital ships, launching precision strikes against propulsion systems and weapons arrays before accelerating beyond retaliation range. Faster destroyer squadrons executed coordinated attack runs that approached from multiple angles simultaneously, forcing enemy vessels to divide their defensive fire ineffectively. Throughout this engagement, Jaghatai's flagship Swordstorm remained in constant motion, never presenting a stationary target for enemy batteries. The massive vessel performed maneuvers that should have been impossible for a ship of its size, a testament to both the skill of its crew and the extensive modifications made to its propulsion systems under the Khan's direction. Its sudden appearances at critical junctures of the battle, delivering devastating broadside salvos before vanishing again into the confusion of combat, demoralized enemy commanders and disrupted their attempts to regain tactical coherence. The battle lasted nearly 18 hours, transforming the once orderly void around Catalyst into a graveyard of crippled trader vessels. Rather than destroying enemy ships outright, the White Scars had systematically targeted propulsion and navigation systems, leaving the trader fleet largely intact but completely immobilized. This approach minimized the time and ammunition expended on each target, while creating a field of drifting hulks that further complicated enemy movement and coordination. When the last operational trader vessel finally withdrew from the engagement, the path to Terra lay open. The White Scars fleet regrouped with remarkable efficiency, Brotherhood vessels smoothly reassuming formation around the Swordstorm. Despite the extended combat, the Legion had lost only 7 ships, a remarkably small toll for breaking such a formidable blockade. More importantly, they had preserved their combat strength for the greater challenge that awaited at the throne world. As they approached the Sol system, the White Scars encountered increasing evidence of the conflict's scale. Debris fields of destroyed vessels created navigational hazards throughout the approach corridors. Automated distress beacons broadcast desperate messages from weeks or months earlier, their senders long dead or fled. Occasional bursts of weapons fire in the distance marked ongoing skirmishes between loyalist patrol groups and trader infiltrators. The outer defenses of the Sol system had been significantly degraded by the time the White Scars arrived. Monitoring stations throughout the Kuiper Belt had been destroyed or subverted, while the once formidable fleet bases orbiting Neptune and Uranus stood abandoned or occupied by trader forces. Only as they approached the inner system did the White Scars encounter substantial loyalist presence, battered Imperial Navy battle groups maintaining tenuous control over critical approach vectors to Terra. The commander of these loyalist forces, Admiral Niora Sukassin, initially received the White Scars with suspicion. Reports of Astartes' treachery had made Imperial forces wary of all Space Marine vessels, regardless of their declared allegiance. The Khan understood this hesitation and submitted to identity verification protocols without objection, providing command codes and authentication sequences that finally convinced the Admiral of their loyalty. Sukassin's briefing revealed the dire situation facing Terra. Horus's forces had established a near-complete blockade of the planet, with only occasional supply ships managing to slip through under cover of carefully orchestrated diversionary actions. The trader fleet maintained orbital supremacy over most of the planet, supporting ground forces that had secured multiple landing zones and were steadily advancing toward the Imperial Palace. Most critically, Loyalist reinforcements had been arriving piecemeal, unable to coordinate their efforts effectively against the trader blockade. The Khan immediately recognized that the situation demanded more than simply adding his forces to the existing defensive perimeter. Breaking through to the surface would require a coordinated effort combining the White Scars' mobility with the remaining Loyalist fleet's firepower. He proposed a daring plan. While Sukassin's naval forces launched a major assault against a designated sector of the blockade, the White Scars would execute a high-speed breakthrough at a seemingly unrelated point, exploiting the distraction to deliver their full strength to the surface in a single operation. The plan required precise timing and complete commitment. Once launched, the White Scars would have no option to retreat or regroup. They would either reach Terra's surface intact or be destroyed in the attempt. Jaghatai made this reality clear to his Brotherhood commanders, none of whom expressed hesitation. After 5 years of fighting across the galaxy to reach this moment, the White Scars were prepared to stake everything on a single, decisive action. The operation commenced with Su Kassan's battle groups launching a massive frontal assault against traitor positions in the southern hemisphere. This attack, while ultimately suicidal, drew enemy ships and attention exactly as intended. As traitor commanders redirected forces to crush this apparent main thrust, the White Scars fleet accelerated toward an approach vector over Terra's northern pole, a route considered too heavily defended for conventional assault. The traitor commanders had established multiple defense layers along this vector, including orbital weapons platforms, patrol squadrons, and ground-based anti-ship batteries. What they had not accounted for was the sheer velocity the White Scars vessels would achieve. Pushing their engines beyond recommended safety parameters, the Legion's ships reached speeds that compressed the window for defensive response to mere seconds. By the time enemy tracking systems locked onto the approaching vessels, they had already passed the optimal interception points. This headlong charge was not without cost. Several White Scars escort vessels succumbed to concentrated defensive fire, while others sustained significant damage that would later require months of repairs. The flagship Swordstorm itself lost portions of its upper decks to a glancing hit from an orbital defense platform. Yet the core of the fleet maintained formation and trajectory, punching through the traitor blockade like a spear through parchment. As they entered Terra's atmosphere, the White Scars faced the second phase of their insertion, identifying a viable landing zone amid the chaos of the planetary surface. Initial plans had called for deployment near the Eternity Wall spaceport, but real-time reconnaissance revealed this area had fallen to traitor forces hours before their arrival. Without breaking stride, Jaghatai redirected the fleet toward the Lion's Gate spaceport, the last major transportation hub still under Loyalist control, though under heavy assault by Death Guard forces. The White Scars' arrival at Lion's Gate coincided with a critical moment in its defense. The Blood Angels, under command of their Primarch Sanguinius, had been holding the massive complex against increasingly overwhelming odds. Death Guard siege units had breached the outer perimeter at multiple points, while plague-bearing bombardments had decimated defensive positions and corrupted large sections of the spaceport's infrastructure. Without reinforcement, the position would have fallen within hours. The 5th Legion's landing changed this calculus dramatically. Drop pods and assault craft descended directly into contested zones, delivering Astartes' strike teams precisely where they would have maximum impact. White Scars jetbike squadrons deployed from low-flying Thunderhawks, immediately engaging Death Guard formations that had been advancing through the spaceport's main concourses. The sudden appearance of fresh troops, attacking from unexpected directions and moving with devastating speed, threw the traitor assault into disarray. Jaghatai himself led the critical push to secure the spaceport's main landing aprons, allowing additional White Scars forces to deploy directly rather than via drop pod. The Khan fought at the forefront of this advance, his legendary blade Moonfang carving through corrupted Astartes' armor with contemptuous ease. Death Guard Terminators attempted to form a blocking position across the primary access corridor, only to find themselves outflanked by Keshig warriors who had infiltrated through maintenance ducts specifically scouted by advance elements. Within hours of their arrival, the White Scars had transformed the battle for Lion's Gate. What had been a desperate defensive action became a fluid engagement where Loyalist forces increasingly dictated the tempo and terms of combat. The Death Guard, accustomed to grinding attrition warfare, found themselves ill-equipped to counter the lightning strikes and rapid redeployments that characterized White Scars operations. Traitor commanders committed increasing numbers to stabilize their positions, unwittingly drawing forces away from other sectors of the siege. The successful defense of Lion's Gate spaceport represented more than a tactical victory. It secured a crucial logistical lifeline to the Imperial Palace, allowing for the movement of supplies, reinforcements, and evacuated civilians. More importantly, it demonstrated that Horus's forces could be effectively countered when faced with appropriate tactical responses, a psychological victory that bolstered defender morale throughout the palace perimeter. With the immediate crisis at Lion's Gate resolved, Jaghatai coordinated with Sanguinius to establish a sustainable defensive strategy for the spaceport complex. The two Primarchs, despite their differing tactical philosophies, quickly developed an effective working relationship. Sanguinius recognized the value of incorporating White Scar's mobility into his defensive plans, while Jaghatai appreciated the Blood Angel's unmatched determination in holding ground once taken. Their combined approach transformed the spaceport from a vulnerable salient into a formidable bastion. Blood Angels held critical junctions and command nodes with characteristic tenacity, while White Scar's rapid reaction forces responded to breaches and probing attacks. This arrangement freed portions of both legions for offensive operations, allowing them to contest areas beyond the immediate perimeter that would otherwise have fallen to traitor control. The Khan particularly focused on disrupting traitor supply lines and communication networks. He personally led several deep-striking raids against Death Guard logistics centers, utilizing the extensive knowledge of siege operations he had gained during the Great Crusade. These operations targeted ammunition dumps, field hospitals, and command bunkers, degrading the traitors' ability to sustain coordinated pressure on the palace defenses. Each raid employed different approaches and attack patterns, preventing enemy commanders from developing effective countermeasures. The conclusion of the Horus Heresy left the Imperium a wounded shadow of its former glory. Territories that had once stood proudly under the Imperial Eagle now lay in ruins or under traitor control. As the surviving Loyalist forces regrouped in the aftermath of their Pyrrhic victory, a new phase of conflict began, the Great Scouring. For the White Scars, this period would prove as defining as the heresy itself, testing not only their martial prowess, but their very identity as sons of Chogoris. Jaghatai Khan emerged from the Siege of Terra with his legion bloodied but largely intact. Unlike the Imperial Fists, who had borne the brunt of defensive operations, or the Blood Angels, devastated by the loss of their Primarch, the White Scars maintained significant combat capability. Their hit-and-run tactics during the siege had preserved their numbers, while still inflicting substantial damage on traitor forces. This relative strength positioned them as one of the primary instruments of Imperial vengeance during the early scouring. The Khan wasted no time in transitioning from defense to offense. Within weeks of Horus's defeat, White Scar's strike forces had begun operations against traitor holdouts throughout the Sol system. Their first major action targeted a Death Guard fortress established on Luna's dark side. Rather than employing a conventional assault, Jaghatai utilized the lessons learned during Terra's defense. Small infiltration teams breached the fortress's outer perimeter at 20 different points simultaneously, planting Melta charges at critical structural junctions before withdrawing. When the charges detonated in sequence, the entire northern quadrant collapsed, exposing the inner chambers to vacuum and eliminating nearly a third of the defenders without direct engagement. This approach, precision strikes against critical vulnerabilities rather than frontal assaults, characterized the White Scars' scouring operations. While other legions often sought to reclaim territory through overwhelming force, Jaghatai's warriors focused on dismantling the traitors' ability to maintain cohesive resistance. They targeted command structures, supply depots, and communication networks, creating cascading failures that forced enemy forces to withdraw or face piecemeal destruction. The Legion's pursuit doctrine found perfect application during this period. As traitor forces retreated toward what would eventually become the Eye of Terror, they left behind rearguard elements to slow Imperial advance. These delaying forces typically established defensive positions at strategic chokepoints, preparing for protracted engagements that would buy time for their main forces. The White Scars systematically negated this strategy by simply bypassing such positions, moving through terrain considered impassable to track and eliminate retreating command elements instead. On Talern, this approach proved particularly effective. Death Guard forces had established an interconnected network of bunkers and artillery positions across the desert world's northern hemisphere, creating a defensive line that Imperial strategists estimated would require months to overcome through conventional means. Rather than engaging this network directly, Jaghatai deployed 5 brotherhoods in a wide encirclement operation. Moving only at night and utilizing specialized equipment developed for desert warfare, these forces infiltrated hundreds of kilometers behind enemy lines. The operation culminated in a coordinated strike against the Death Guard's forward logistics bases. Without ammunition, water, or medical supplies, the supposedly impregnable defensive line collapsed within days. Imperial Army forces advancing across the desert found abandoned positions and discarded equipment where they had expected fanatical resistance. The few Death Guard captured revealed that their commanders had ordered immediate withdrawal upon realizing their supply lines had been completely severed. This pattern repeated across dozens of worlds during the early scouring. The White Scars became known as the Emperor's Executioners, not because they inflicted the most casualties, but because their appearances heralded the inevitable collapse of traitor resistance. Their reputation alone often proved sufficient to break enemy morale, with reports of White Scars scout elements triggering mass evacuations among traitor forces unwilling to face the Legion's retribution. The Khan's personal involvement in these operations added another dimension to their effectiveness. Unlike some Primarchs who directed campaigns from command centers, Jaghatai continued to lead from the front, participating directly in strike missions against high-value targets. On Velshir II, he personally eliminated 3 traitor Astartes commanders in a lightning raid that penetrated to the heart of their fortress monastery. On Calidus, he led a jet bike squadron through toxic wastelands to destroy a word-bearer's ritual site, preventing the completion of a summoning that would have devastated loyalist forces across the sector. These direct interventions served both tactical and symbolic purposes. Practically, they brought the Khan's unmatched combat prowess to bear at critical junctures, resolving situations that might have required much larger forces otherwise. Symbolically, they demonstrated that no traitor, regardless of rank or protection, could escape justice, a message that resonated with both loyalist forces seeking reassurance and traitor elements considering their options. The psychological dimension of the White Scars' scouring operations extended beyond mere intimidation. The Legion developed sophisticated approaches to breaking enemy cohesion through uncertainty and misinformation. They would deliberately leave survivors from certain engagements while ensuring no witnesses remained from others, creating confusion about their actual strength and location. They established distinctive calling cards at attack sites, particular arrangements of enemy dead or symbolic markings that conveyed specific messages to traitor commanders about the inevitability of their defeat. This psychological warfare proved particularly effective against the Alpha Legion, whose operations relied heavily on information control and strategic deception. The White Scars countered these advantages by introducing deliberate inconsistencies into their own patterns, becoming effectively unpredictable even to adversaries specialized in prediction. After several disastrous engagements where Alpha Legion trap formations found themselves becoming the trapped, traitor commanders began avoiding contact with White Scars forces entirely, a significant strategic victory achieved with minimal direct combat. As the scouring progressed, the nature of the conflict evolved. The initial phase of pursuing retreating traitor forces gave way to the more complex challenge of reclaiming corrupted worlds. Many planets that had fallen under traitor control during the heresy had been fundamentally transformed, their populations indoctrinated, their environments polluted, their very reality warped by warp influence. Conventional military operations alone could not address these deeper contaminations. The White Scars adapted to these challenges by incorporating their Stormseers more centrally into combat operations. These psychically gifted warriors, whose shamanic traditions had always included techniques for cleansing spiritual corruption, developed new applications for their abilities focused on detecting and neutralizing warp taint. Working in concert with more conventional forces, Stormseer cadres identified compromised locations and individuals, allowing for surgical removal of corruption rather than indiscriminate purges. On Gathais II, this approach saved millions of lives. The planet had fallen under Wordbearer's influence early in the heresy, with significant portions of the population exposed to corrupting rituals and propaganda. Initial imperial assessment recommended exterminatus as the only certain solution, but Jaghatai personally intervened to attempt a more measured response. Under his direction, White Scars Stormseers conducted a systematic survey of population centers, identifying specific districts and facilities where corruption had taken root, while confirming that approximately 70% of the population remained salvageable. Based on this assessment, the Legion executed a precisely targeted campaign that eliminated corrupted elements while preserving the planet's overall habitability and social structure. Rather than the planetary devastation that characterized many scouring operations, Gathai's 2 emerged with its major infrastructure intact and sufficient population to maintain essential functions. Within a decade, it had resumed its role as a productive imperial world, a testament to the efficacy of the White Scars' discriminating approach to corruption. This period of intense activity came to an abrupt end approximately 70 years after the heresy's conclusion. Reports from the Galactic East indicated a significant Dark Eldar raid against human colonies near the Chogorian home system. Given the potential threat to their recruitment world, the White Scars responded immediately, with Jaghatai himself leading the pursuit force. Initial engagements proved successful, with several Dark Eldar vessels destroyed and captives rescued from the raiders' clutches. The operation took an unexpected turn when the retreating Xenos vessels entered a previously uncharted webway portal. Rather than allowing his prey to escape, Jaghatai made the fateful decision to continue pursuit into the alien dimension. He led a strike force comprising his personal Keshig guard and elements from 3 different brotherhoods into the swirling darkness of the webway entrance. None of them would be seen again in Imperial space. The disappearance of their Primarch created an unprecedented crisis for the White Scars. Unlike other legions whose Primarchs had fallen in known circumstances, they faced the torment of uncertainty. Had Jaghatai been killed, captured? Did he continue his pursuit somewhere in the labyrinthine depths of the webway? Without definitive answers, the Legion found itself unable to properly mourn or move forward. This limbo coincided with the implementation of the Codex Astartes reforms, adding another layer of complexity to an already challenging transition. Robute Guilliman's directive that the legions be divided into smaller chapters met with significant resistance among the White Scars. The brotherhood system that had defined their organizational structure for centuries seemed fundamentally incompatible with the rigid company structure prescribed by the Codex. The Legion's leadership, now centered around a council of senior brotherhood commanders, debated their response to these reforms extensively. Some advocated for outright rejection, arguing that their Primarch had established their traditions and only he could authorize such fundamental changes. Others recognized the political reality that resistance would likely prove futile and potentially dangerous given the Imperium's fragile post-heresy state. The compromise they ultimately reached demonstrated the adaptive pragmatism that had always characterized their approach to imperial authority. Outwardly, the White Scars would reorganize according to Codex specifications, establishing the requisite companies and command structure. In practice, however, they would maintain their cultural traditions and operational methodologies within this new framework. The 10th Company, officially designated for scout duties, would continue the training practices established under Chogorian tradition. The 1st Company would preserve the elite status and function of the Keshig, albeit under different terminology. This surface-level compliance, while maintaining cultural continuity, became the template for how the White Scars navigated the increasingly bureaucratic imperium of the post-heresy era. They adopted the language and forms required by imperial authorities while preserving the substance of their traditions within these structures. When administratum officials inquired about certain practices, they received responses couched in acceptable terminology, regardless of whether that terminology accurately described the reality of White Scars operations. The most significant adaptation involved their recruitment practices. The Codex prescribed specific procedures for identifying and processing potential Astartes candidates, procedures that bore little resemblance to the tribal trials traditionally used on Chogoris. Rather than abandoning their cultural methods, the White Scars simply created a parallel process. candidates would first undergo the traditional trials on the steppes, supervised by tribal elders and chapter representatives. Those who succeeded would then be processed through the officially sanctioned recruitment protocols, which were treated as mere formalities, confirming selections already made. This dual system ensured that the chapter maintained its distinctive cultural identity despite the homogenizing pressure of codex compliance. New battle brothers continued to learn the traditions of the steppes alongside standard Astartes combat doctrines. They still received their ritual scarification, composed battle poems, and participated in the naming ceremonies for their weapons and equipment. Most importantly, they absorbed the philosophical underpinnings of White Scar's identity, the emphasis on individual excellence within collective action, the balance between discipline and autonomy, and the spiritual dimensions of warfare. The preservation of Stormseer traditions proved particularly challenging in the post-heresy environment. The Council of Nicaea's restrictions on psychic activities, though technically superseded during the later heresy, cast a long shadow over the Imperium's approach to psychers. The Codex Astartes established the Librarius as the only sanctioned framework for Astartes psychic activities, with specific limitations and monitoring requirements that conflicted with Chogorian shamanic practices. Here again, the White Scars adopted a strategy of surface compliance covering deeper continuity. Their librarians underwent all required imperial training and certification, maintaining impeccable formal records of their activities and abilities. Within the chapter's monasteries and during deployments, however, they continued to function as Stormseers, maintaining the meditative practices, ritual observances, and holistic approach to psychic phenomena that had characterized their order since its inception on Chogoris. This careful balancing act between compliance and tradition extended to the chapter's combat doctrine as well. The Codex Astartes prescribed specific tactical approaches for different battlefield situations, many of which conflicted with the more fluid, intuitive methods favored by the White Scars. Rather than abandoning their proven techniques, chapter commanders became adept at retroactively documenting operations in Codex-compliant terminology, regardless of how the engagements had actually unfolded. A strike force might execute a classic Chogorian encirclement maneuver, complete with feigned retreat and multi-vector assault, yet the after-action report would describe it as a series of tactical withdrawals followed by coordinated advances, language that satisfied Imperial reviewers while bearing only passing resemblance to actual events. Over time, this practice became so ingrained that White Scars officers developed an entire parallel vocabulary, seamlessly translating their native tactical concepts into officially acceptable terminology when communicating with external authorities. The success of these adaptation strategies allowed the White Scars to maintain their essential character, despite the profound institutional changes sweeping the post-heresy Imperium. While other first founding chapters sometimes struggled with their identities under the new dispensation, the Sons of Chogoris demonstrated the same flexibility in organizational matters that had always characterized their approach to warfare. They bent without breaking, adapted without surrendering, and preserved their core while modifying their exterior. This resilience proved fortunate, as the challenges facing the chapter only intensified in the centuries following their Primarch's disappearance. The Imperium entered a long period of retrenchment and consolidation, with defensive operations taking precedence over the expansionist campaigns that had characterized the Great Crusade era. For a chapter whose tactical doctrine centered on aggressive mobility and pursuit, this shift in strategic priorities required significant adjustment. The White Scars responded by developing specialized approaches to defensive warfare that maintained their emphasis on mobility. Rather than holding fixed positions, they established rapid response forces that could reinforce threatened sectors across wide areas of responsibility. They perfected the art of the spoiling attack, precision strikes against enemy formations in the early stages of offensive buildup, disrupting assault preparations before they could be completed. These adaptations allowed them to fulfill their defensive obligations while maintaining tactical approaches aligned with their traditional strengths. The spiritual traditions of the White Scars trace their origins to the windswept steppes of Chogoris, where ancient nomadic tribes lived in harmony with the natural world. Unlike many Astartes chapters whose belief systems revolve around veneration of the emperor or adherence to rigid codes of conduct, the Sons of Jaghatai developed a more nuanced spiritual framework that honors the primal forces of nature and the wisdom of ancestors. At the core of White Scar's spirituality lies their reverence for the spirits of air and storm. These forces represent not merely destructive power, but the fundamental principles of change, freedom, and transformation. Chogorian tribesmen believed that the winds carried the voices of ancestors and the will of greater powers, making the open sky a conduit for communion with forces beyond mortal understanding. This tradition transferred seamlessly to Astartes' existence, with battle brothers often spending hours in meditation beneath open skies before major engagements, listening for guidance in the patterns of wind and cloud. The chapter maintains specialized meditation chambers within their fortress monastery on Chogoris, designed with open ceilings that allow unfiltered exposure to the elements. During particularly significant storms, senior officers gather in these spaces to interpret the messages carried by thunder and lightning. These interpretations are not considered infallible prophecies, but rather insights to be weighed alongside more conventional intelligence and tactical assessments. The relationship between White Scars and the storm spirits is one of mutual respect rather than supplication or control. They view themselves as partners with these forces rather than their masters or servants. This partnership manifests most visibly during the Rite of the Eternal Sky, performed annually on the anniversary of Jaghatai's disappearance into the webway. The entire chapter, excepting only those on critical deployments, gathers on the highest plateau of the Kumkarta Mountains. There they arrange themselves in a massive circular formation, with each battle brother positioned precisely according to his brotherhood and rank. At the center stands the chapter master with the most senior stormseers, who conduct a complex ritual involving ceremonial weapons, traditional incense, and rhythmic chanting that continues from sunset to sunrise. The purpose of this rite extends beyond mere commemoration. The White Scars believe that the spirits of air and storm exist partially outside conventional time, experiencing past, present, and future simultaneously. Through proper ritual observance, they seek to maintain a connection with their missing Primarch regardless of where or when he might be. The ceremony includes periods of absolute silence during which all present listen intently for any whisper that might be carried on the wind, any hint of Jaghatai's continued existence or eventual return. Whether such messages have ever been received remains one of the chapter's most closely guarded secrets. Beyond these formalized observances, White Scars incorporate spiritual awareness into their daily activities through countless smaller practices. Battle brothers offer drops of water to the air before drinking, symbolically sharing sustenance with the spirits that surround them. They hang small strips of cloth from their personal weapons and vehicles, believing these fluttering tokens attract favorable attention from beneficial entities. Before entering battle, many warriors whisper their true names to the wind, ensuring that should they fall, the spirits will guide their souls back to the eternal sky of Chogoris, rather than becoming lost in the void. Central to maintaining these traditions are the Stormseers, whose role within the chapter extends far beyond the conventional duties of Space Marine librarians. While officially conforming to Codex Astartes' classifications of Lexicanium, Codiceer, and Epistolary, in practice they function as spiritual guides whose responsibilities encompass every aspect of chapter life. A Stormseer serves simultaneously as combat psyker, historical chronicler, ritual officiant, philosophical counselor, and keeper of tribal wisdom, roles that frequently place them in positions of influence exceeding their formal rank. The training of these specialized psykers begins long before their induction into the chapter. On Chogoris, children who display psychic sensitivity are identified by tribal shamans and subjected to a series of tests designed to evaluate not just their raw power, but their spiritual resilience and connection to natural forces. Those who demonstrate the required qualities undergo years of preparation under tribal mentors, learning traditional techniques for communing with the spirits of air and storm, while developing mental disciplines that protect against warp predation. This pre-induction training creates a foundation that distinguishes Stormseers from librarians of other chapters. While the latter typically approach psychic phenomena through analytical frameworks derived from Imperial scholarship, Stormseers understand their abilities through experiential wisdom passed down through countless generations. They learn to perceive the warp not as an abstract dimension of energy, but as a realm of spirits with distinct personalities, motivations, and relationships, entities that must be respected and negotiated with rather than simply harnessed as power sources. The shamanic practices of Stormseers incorporate elaborate rituals designed to maintain favorable relationships with beneficial spirits while warding against malevolent entities. Before major deployments, they conduct ceremonies involving sacred herbs burned in copper vessels, creating smoke that spirals upward in patterns they interpret as omens for the coming campaign. They craft personal talismans for battle brothers facing particular challenges, incorporating materials, feathers, stones, metal fragments that resonate with specific protective energies. Most importantly, they maintain the chapter's spiritual equilibrium through regular purification rites that cleanse accumulated psychic residue from weapons, armor, and living quarters. These practices proved particularly valuable during the turbulent years following the formation of the Great Rift, when warp storms and demonic incursions threatened Imperial worlds across the galaxy. White Scar's forces deployed to affected regions demonstrated remarkable resistance to psychic corruption, with Stormseers detecting and neutralizing warp influences that other chapters' librarians failed to identify. Their success derived not from greater raw power, but from their holistic understanding of spiritual ecosystems and the subtle interactions between material and immaterial realms. The effectiveness of these traditional approaches has not prevented criticism from more orthodox imperial institutions. Representatives of the Inquisition's Ordo Hereticus have periodically investigated the chapter's spiritual practices, concerned that their animistic beliefs might constitute prohibited worship of warp entities. Such investigations invariably conclude without formal censure, as the White Scars maintain meticulous records demonstrating that their traditions remain firmly within acceptable parameters of the Imperial Creed. The chapter's exemplary combat record and unwavering loyalty through millennia of service provide additional insulation against serious accusations. Beyond their spiritual functions, Stormseers serve as living repositories of chapter history and cultural knowledge. In keeping with Chogorian tradition, they maintain this heritage through oral recitation rather than written documentation. Each Stormseer memorizes thousands of battle poems, tactical parables, and biographical accounts, preserving them with perfect recall enhanced by psychic mnemonic techniques. During ceremonial gatherings, they recite these narratives in elaborate performances that combine spoken word, subtle psychic projections, and ritualized movement, creating immersive experiences that transmit not just information but emotional and spiritual context to their audience. This emphasis on oral tradition rather than written records serves several purposes. It ensures that crucial knowledge remains accessible even during extended deployments away from chapter archives. It preserves nuances of meaning that might be lost in text transcription. Most pragmatically, it provides a measure of security against information theft or corruption, knowledge that exists only in the minds of Stormseers protected by formidable psychic defenses proves remarkably resistant to enemy intelligence gathering. Complementing the spiritual guidance of Stormseers are the physical traditions that mark a White Scar's Battle Brothers progression through chapter ranks. Most visible among these is ritual scarification, a practice directly inherited from Chogorian tribal culture. Unlike decorative tattoos or honor markings worn by other chapters, White Scar's scars represent specific achievements and experiences, forming a physical record of each warrior's journey that can be read by his brothers. The process begins during initiation, when successful aspirants receive their first scar, a single horizontal line across the left cheek that marks their acceptance into the chapter. This initial marking is performed by the recruit's primary instructor using a ceremonial blade of Chogorian manufacture, its edge coated with alchemical compounds that ensure the resulting scar remains prominent despite Astartes' healing abilities. The ceremony takes place at dawn, with the recruit facing east toward the rising sun as the blade draws blood, symbolizing the beginning of his new life as a son of the Khan. As a battle brother progresses through his service, he accumulates additional scars marking significant experiences. Completing his first combat deployment earns a vertical line intersecting the initial horizontal mark, creating a simple cross. Participating in a campaign against a major Xenos threat adds specific patterns depending on the enemy faced: serrated lines for Tyranids, circular formations for Orcs, delicate spirals for Eldar. Leadership positions, specialist training, and acts of exceptional courage each carry their own distinctive markings, creating an increasingly complex tapestry of scars that chronicle the warrior's development. The most honored scars come from combat with worthy opponents. When a White Scar's battle brother defeats an enemy champion in single combat, tradition dictates that he incorporate an element of that victory into his scarification. This might involve using the defeated enemy's weapon to create the mark, patterning the scar after a distinctive feature of the opponent's appearance, or positioning it on his body to mirror wounds received during the encounter. These combat scars are considered particularly significant, as they represent not just personal achievement, but the chapter's dominance over its enemies. The application of these marks follows strict protocols overseen by the Brotherhood's senior members. The warrior must first present his case before a gathering of veterans, describing the achievement he believes merits recognition and submitting to their questioning. If they judge the deed worthy, they determine the appropriate design and placement for the new scar. The actual marking is performed during a ceremony attended by the warrior's closest battle brothers, who bear witness to his endurance during the procedure, conducted without pain suppressants regardless of the scar's complexity or size. Beyond scarification, the White Scars practice numerous other coming-of-age rituals that mark a warrior's progression. Upon elevation to full battle brother status, each Astartes undertakes the Kumkarta trial, a solitary journey across Chogoris' most treacherous mountain range, equipped with only a combat knife and the clothes on his back. The journey typically requires 2 weeks of continuous travel through extreme conditions, testing not just physical endurance but psychological resilience and problem-solving abilities. Those who complete the trial return to receive their first suit of power armor, now earned through demonstrated self-reliance. Promotion to squad leadership positions involves the ritual of the 5 wounds, during which the aspirant leader must endure combat against 5 veteran warriors in succession without rest or medical attention between bouts. The fights are not to submission, but continue until the veterans decide the candidate has demonstrated sufficient skill and determination. The wounds received during these contests are left to heal naturally for 5 days before treatment, with the resulting scars serving as permanent reminders of the responsibilities of command. Perhaps most significant among these progression rituals is the naming of the blade, conducted when a battle brother receives his first power weapon. The recipient spends 3 days in isolation, meditating on his combat experiences and spiritual connection to the storm spirits. At the conclusion of this period, he announces the name he has chosen for his weapon, a designation that should reflect both his personal combat philosophy and his understanding of the weapon's unique properties. This name becomes integral to the warrior's identity, with many battle brothers becoming known by combinations of their personal name and their blade's designation: Jubal of the Silent Edge or Corlo Doomwhisper. These physical traditions and ceremonies serve to reinforce the chapter's distinctive warrior philosophy, known as the Path of Heaven. This comprehensive approach to warfare extends beyond mere tactical doctrine to encompass fundamental principles about the nature of combat, the purpose of the warrior, and the relationship between individual excellence and collective action. Unlike the codified combat manuals of chapters like the Ultramarines, the Path of Heaven exists primarily as an oral tradition transmitted through direct instruction, demonstrative example, and philosophical discourse. At its core, this philosophy emphasizes freedom, speed, and decisive action. White Scars are taught to view the battlefield as a dynamic environment where mobility creates opportunity and hesitation invites defeat. They learn to identify the precise moment when action becomes necessary and to commit themselves fully without reservation once that moment arrives. Most importantly, they develop the judgment to distinguish between situations that require immediate intervention and those that benefit from patient observation, the wisdom to know when to strike and when to circle. This approach manifests in the chapter's preference for rapid assault tactics and their legendary skill with jet bikes and other fast attack vehicles. White Scars battle brothers spend thousands of hours mastering these platforms, developing an intuitive connection with their machines that approaches the bond between Chogorian nomads and their horses. They learn to perceive terrain features not as obstacles, but as opportunities, using elevation changes, dense vegetation, and urban structures to mask their approach or amplify the impact of their strikes. The philosophical underpinnings of the Path of Heaven extend beyond tactical considerations to encompass broader questions of purpose and meaning. White Scars are taught that the true warrior fights not from hatred or fear, but from a place of inner stillness, what Chogorian tradition calls the quiet at the storm's heart. This mental state, cultivated through meditation practices and reinforced through combat experience, allows them to act with perfect clarity unclouded by emotion or distraction. They strike not in anger, but in recognition of necessity, executing their duty with precision rather than passion. This emphasis on mental discipline counterbalances the chapter's reputation for wild, nomadic ferocity. Behind their fearsome appearance and aggressive tactics lies a sophisticated understanding of warfare as both physical and psychological contest. White Scars learn to recognize the moment when an enemy's cohesion begins to fracture, when confidence transforms into uncertainty, when determination gives way to doubt. They study the subtle indicators of these psychological shifts and develop techniques to accelerate them, understanding that battles are often won in the mind before they conclude on the field. The aftermath of the Scouring marked a transition for the White Scars. With their Primarch vanished into the webway and the Imperium restructuring under the Codex Astartes, the sons of Chogoris faced the challenge of maintaining their identity while adapting to a galaxy forever changed by the heresy. The chapter's response was characteristically pragmatic. They would honor their traditions by continuing to wage war in the manner of their ancestors, demonstrating through deed rather than word that the spirit of Jaghatai lived on in his sons. The hunt for Valdoria stands as perhaps the most celebrated White Scars campaign of the post-heresy era. In the late 41st millennium, the Alpha Legion demon Prince Kernax Valdorius established a reign of terror across the Quintus subsector, capturing planetary defense forces and converting them into personal armies. His mastery of guerrilla tactics and deceptive warfare made conventional imperial responses ineffective, with 3 separate guard regiments lost attempting to bring him to battle. Chapter Master Jaghatai Khan recognized that defeating Valdorius required the White Scars' particular expertise. He dispatched 3rd Company under the command of Corsaro Khan, with instructions to hunt the Demon Prince to the ends of the galaxy if necessary. What followed was a masterclass in pursuit operations that spanned 7 years and 12 systems. Corsaro employed small scout teams operating independently across vast areas, establishing an intelligence network that gradually identified patterns in Valdorius's movements and operations. The breakthrough came on Quintus III when White Scars infiltrators discovered that the Demon Prince maintained a network of psychic beacons to coordinate his dispersed forces. Rather than attacking these beacons directly, Corsaro implemented a sophisticated counterintelligence operation. His Stormseers modified the beacons to transmit subtly altered messages, introducing small discrepancies in coordinates and timing that gradually degraded the effectiveness of Valdorius's command structure. As the Demon Prince's operations began showing signs of confusion, Corsaro increased pressure with precisely targeted raids against supply caches and forward bases. Each strike was designed not to maximize casualties, but to create specific vulnerabilities that would force Valdorius to personally intervene. The White Scars were deliberately creating weaknesses that only the Demon Prince himself could address, effectively baiting a trap with his own pride. The campaign culminated at Quintus Prime, where Valdorius gathered his remaining forces for a decisive counterattack against what he believed was an overextended White Scars position. Instead, he found himself facing not just Corsaro's hunters, but also elements of the Raven Guard 10th Company under Shadow Captain Kayvon Shrike, who had been pursuing the Demon Prince for his own reasons. The resulting battle demonstrated the effectiveness of combining the White Scars' mobile striking power with the Raven Guard's infiltration capabilities, with both chapters coordinating their distinctive approaches to pin Valdorius between them. The Demon Prince fell to Corsaro's power saber Moonfang after a brutal duel amid the ruins of Mankura Hive. Following tradition, the Khan took Valdorius's head as a trophy, having it carefully preserved and mounted on his personal transport. The victory earned Corsaro the title Khan of Quanzhou and cemented the chapter's reputation for relentless pursuit regardless of time or distance, a reputation that continues to serve them as both tactical advantage and strategic deterrent. During the Third War for Armageddon, the White Scars demonstrated their ability to adapt traditional tactics to the challenges of urban warfare. When Gaz Kulthrakas engulfed the Vital Hive world, the chapter deployed 7th Company under the command of Jaghatai Khan to support Imperial defense efforts. Rather than joining the static defense lines established by the Imperial Fists and Steel Legion, Jaghatai implemented a dynamic response strategy focused on maintaining mobility even within the confining environment of Armageddon's Hive cities. His forces modified their vehicles for urban operations, adding reinforced ramming plates to Rhino transports and reconfiguring land speeders with specialized sensor arrays capable of navigating through the dense smoke and debris that filled the lower Hive levels. Most significantly, they developed new tactics for their assault bikes, creating Thunder Run protocols that allowed bike squadrons to penetrate deep into Orc-held territory and return before enemy forces could organize effective interception. These Thunder Runs targeted Orc logistics rather than combat units, fuel depots, ammunition stores, food caches, and particularly the squig pens that provided the Greenskins with biological resources. By systematically eliminating these support structures, the White Scars gradually degraded the Orcs' ability to sustain offensive operations without directly engaging their superior numbers. Imperial commanders initially criticized this approach as avoiding real combat, but the resulting reduction in Orc pressure against critical defensive positions eventually vindicated Joghaitan's strategy. The campaign's defining moment came during the battle for Fire Forge, when Orc forces threatened to overrun the massive Promethium processing facility that supplied fuel for Imperial vehicles across the southern continent. Conventional wisdom suggested the facility was indefensible, with its sprawling pipelines and storage tanks creating too many vulnerabilities for a static defense to address. Rather than abandoning this critical infrastructure, Joghaitan implemented what he called a flowing defense, a continuous movement of White Scars units throughout the facility that created the impression of a much larger defending force. Bike squadrons would appear at one section of the perimeter, engage approaching Orcs with devastating firepower, then disappear before enemy heavy units could respond. Minutes later, the same squadrons would strike from a completely different direction, creating confusion in the Orc command structure about the actual distribution of Imperial forces. This approach prevented the Greenskins from concentrating their numerical advantage at any single point, effectively neutralizing their primary tactical advantage. After 3 weeks of failed attempts to capture the facility, the Orc warlord Morkrol Grimskar personally led a massed assault intended to overwhelm the defenders through sheer numbers. Joghaitan had anticipated this escalation and prepared accordingly. As the Orc horde approached the main gate in a tightly packed formation, White Scars Tech Marines detonated carefully placed demolition charges that breached the facility's main Promethium pipeline. The resulting conflagration engulfed the leading edge of the Orc formation, creating panic and disorder that rippled back through their ranks. In this moment of confusion, Joghaitan launched a decapitation strike directly at Grimskar, 3 assault squads on bikes punched through the disorganized orc lines, their power lances lowered like the lances of ancient Chogorian horse warriors. The Khan himself reached the warlord and engaged him in single combat, eventually severing the orc's head with a precisely placed strike from his tulwar. Without their leader, the orc assault collapsed into disorganized bands that were systematically eliminated by White Scar's strike teams over the following days. The successful defense of Fire Forge proved crucial to maintaining Imperial mobility throughout the southern theater, allowing Guard armored units to continue operations that would otherwise have been crippled by fuel shortages. More broadly, the campaign demonstrated the White Scar's ability to apply their traditional emphasis on mobility and precision strikes, even in environments seemingly ill-suited to such tactics, a flexibility that distinguishes them from chapters more rigidly bound to specific operational parameters. The chapter's history has been shaped by the leadership of exceptional individuals who embodied the warrior spirit of Chogoris while adapting to the changing demands of Imperial service. Among these, Jubal Khan stands as a pivotal figure who guided the chapter through the tumultuous period following the War of the Beast. Elevated to chapter master in the year 546 of the 32nd millennium, he inherited a command structure still recovering from significant losses suffered during that conflict and facing increased scrutiny from Imperial authorities concerned about the reliability of Astartes' forces. Jubal's approach to these challenges reflected the pragmatic adaptability that had long characterized White Scar's leadership. Rather than directly opposing increased oversight, he implemented subtle organizational changes that maintained the chapter's cultural identity while presenting external compliance with Imperial expectations. He restructured the training regimen for new recruits to include required study of the Codex Astartes, alongside traditional Chogorian combat techniques, allowing battle brothers to demonstrate textbook knowledge of Codex doctrine when required while actually employing more effective traditional methods in practice. More significantly, Jubal expanded the chapter's recruitment beyond Chogoris itself, establishing small training outposts on several worlds within their operational territory. This decision, controversial among traditionalists within the chapter, proved prescient when warp storms temporarily isolated Chogoris from Imperial space in the early 33rd millennium. While other chapters dependent on single recruitment worlds faced existential crises during similar isolations, the White Scars maintained operational strength through their distributed recruitment network. Jubal's most lasting contribution came through his codification of the chapter's oral traditions into what became known as the Teachings of the Hunt. Recognizing that the increasing dispersion of White Scars forces across the galaxy threatened the transmission of cultural knowledge that had previously occurred naturally within the close confines of the fortress monastery, he gathered the chapter's most respected veterans and stormseers for a year-long conclave on Chogoris. The resulting compilation of tactical doctrines, philosophical principles, and historical accounts provided a common reference point that helped maintain cultural cohesion despite physical separation. Jaghatai Khan, who led the chapter during the late 41st millennium, faced perhaps the greatest challenges since the heresy when the 13th Black Crusade erupted from the Eye of Terror. As Abaddon's forces spread across the galaxy, the White Scars found themselves responding to multiple crisis points simultaneously, stretching their resources to unprecedented degrees. Jaghatai's strategic acumen manifested in his prioritization decisions, rather than committing major forces to the main theaters where numerous chapters were already engaged. He directed White Scars companies to secondary fronts where their mobility could make decisive differences. This approach proved particularly effective in the Kangrel system, where traitor forces had established forward bases to support operations against more prominent targets. 3 White Scars companies under Jaghatai's direct command executed a series of coordinated strikes against these facilities, eliminating crucial logistical support that traitor main forces had been depending on. The resulting disruption forced enemy commanders to divert significant resources away from their primary objectives, indirectly relieving pressure on Imperial defenders at Cadia and other major battlegrounds. Kublai's most crucial decision came when astropathic communications indicated that Chogoris itself faced imminent attack by a Red Corsair's fleet. Dividing his forces, always a dangerous proposition during wartime, he led half his available strength back to defend the chapter homeworld, while dispatching the remainder under his senior captain to continue operations against Black Crusade elements. This division of focus represented a significant gamble, risking inadequate strength at both locations. The defense of Chogoris became one of the most desperate engagements in chapter history. The Red Corsairs, led by the former Astral Claw's Huron Blackheart, deployed significant forces, including corrupted Titans and demon engines, against the White Scar's Fortress Monastery. Outnumbered nearly 5-1, Kublai implemented an asymmetric defense that emphasized mobility over fixed positions. Even the massive Fortress Monastery itself was treated as a fluid battleground rather than a static defensive position, with pre-planned demolition charges used to create new avenues of movement when existing corridors became compromised. For 16 days, White Scar's forces conducted a fighting retreat through their own fortress, yielding ground strategically while inflicting maximum casualties on the attackers. Kublai personally led counter-attacks at critical junctures, appearing with his command squad at seemingly impossible locations to strike at enemy vulnerabilities before disappearing again into the labyrinthine structure. This approach prevented the Red Corsairs from consolidating their gains, forcing them to maintain dispersed forces to hold captured sections against potential counterattacks. The turning point came when a White Scar's fleet element, returning from operations near the Maelstrom, arrived in system, catching the Red Corsairs' vessels in an unexpectedly vulnerable orbital configuration. The resulting void battle damaged several key trader ships, including Blackheart's flagship, forcing the Red Corsairs to withdraw before they could complete their objective of destroying the Fortress Monastery. While the White Scars had suffered significant casualties and infrastructure damage, they had preserved their chapter homeworld and recruitment capabilities, a strategic victory that would prove crucial in the years to come. The arrival of Primaris Marines following Robute Guilliman's resurrection presented yet another adaptation challenge for the chapter. These new warriors, created through Belisarius Call's modifications to the original Astartes template, represented both opportunity and potential threat to the White Scar's cultural identity. Their enhanced capabilities offered tactical advantages, but their creation outside traditional chapter structures raised questions about how thoroughly they could be integrated into the White Scar's distinctive warrior culture. The chapter's response demonstrated their pragmatic approach to change. Rather than segregating Primaris Marines into separate units as some chapters did, the White Scars immediately integrated them across existing company structures. Each Primaris warrior was paired with a veteran battle brother who served as both combat instructor and cultural mentor, teaching the traditional combat techniques and philosophical principles that define the chapter. These pairings often developed into the Jaga bonds central to White Scar's brotherhood, creating connections that transcended the differences in their creation. Particularly important was the integration of Primaris Marines into the chapter's mounted warfare traditions. While their enhanced physiology made them even more effective on assault bikes and land speeders, they lacked the lifetime of experience that traditional White Scars brought to vehicle operations. To address this gap, the chapter established specialized training protocols that compressed decades of experience into intensive programs, with veteran bike squads working directly with Primaris battle brothers to develop the intuitive understanding of mounted combat essential to White Scar's operations. The ultimate test of this integration came during the Plague Wars, when White Scar's forces, including significant Primaris elements, engaged Death Guard units on Gathalammer. The battle demonstrated that the new warriors had successfully absorbed not just the tactical doctrines, but the underlying philosophy of their chapter. Primaris bike squadrons executed classic Chogorian encirclement maneuvers with precision that matched their veteran counterparts, while Primaris officers demonstrated the initiative and tactical flexibility that had always characterized White Scar's command. Most significantly, When Chapter Master Jubal Khan was temporarily incapacitated by a Death Guard biological weapon, command seamlessly transferred to a Primaris captain who directed the remainder of the engagement according to traditional White Scars principles. This officer, Korsugai, had so thoroughly internalized the chapter's approach that veterans followed his directives without hesitation despite his relatively recent addition to their ranks. The successful operation under his command effectively ended questions about whether Primaris Marines could truly become sons of Chogoris in spirit as well as gene seed. Throughout these campaigns and transitions, the White Scars have maintained their distinctive approach to warfare while adapting to changing circumstances. Their continued effectiveness stems not from rigid adherence to tradition, but from fidelity to underlying principles that transcend specific tactics or technologies. Speed, precision, independence, and brotherhood remain their defining characteristics, whether fighting from the backs of Chogorian horses, ancient pattern assault bikes, or the latest Primaris grav vehicles. In this adaptability while maintaining essential identity, they continue to honor the legacy of their Primarch, who taught them that the true path to victory lies not in strength alone, but in the wisdom to apply that strength at precisely the right moment. The formation of the Great Rift fundamentally changed the strategic landscape of the galaxy. When the immense warp tier split the Imperium in two, the White Scars found themselves facing unprecedented challenges that would test their adaptability and resolve. Initial reports reaching Chogoris described a catastrophe of galactic proportions, countless worlds lost to demonic incursions, entire sectors cut off from communication, and Imperial forces scattered and isolated across what remained of the Emperor's domain. Chapter Master Jubal Khan immediately recognized that conventional response strategies would prove inadequate to this crisis. Rather than consolidating their forces to defend specific sectors as many chapters did, he implemented what became known as the Scattered Storm Doctrine. White Scars companies were deployed independently across multiple theaters, each with broad strategic objectives, but complete tactical autonomy. This approach maximized the chapter's ability to respond to threats across a wide area while maintaining the operational flexibility that had always been their hallmark. When the Indomitus Crusade began in earnest, the White Scars found natural alignment with Guilliman's strategic vision. The Primarch's emphasis on mobility, coordinated strikes, and rapid redeployment between theaters mirrored the approach the Sons of Chogoris had employed for millennia. White Scars contingents served as vanguard elements for numerous Crusade battle groups, conducting reconnaissance, eliminating forward enemy positions, and creating breaches in defensive lines that heavier Imperial forces could exploit. During the liberation of Ophelia 7, the White Scars Third Company demonstrated the continued effectiveness of their traditional tactics against even the most daunting opponents. Death Guard forces had established a series of interlocking defensive positions around the planet's primary hive city, using biological weapons to create contaminated zones that channeled attackers into prepared killing fields. Rather than engaging these defenses directly, Khan Kanzumai identified a critical vulnerability in the enemy's deployment. Their defensive orientation focused entirely on ground-level approaches, with minimal attention to aerial vectors. Zumai organized his forces into small, highly mobile strike teams equipped with grav chutes and jump packs. These teams infiltrated through the upper levels of the hive spires, bypassing the contaminated zones entirely. Once behind enemy lines, they conducted coordinated attacks against command nodes and biological weapon dispersal systems, degrading the Death Guard's ability to maintain their defensive perimeter. When Imperial Guard forces launched their main assault 24 hours later, they encountered significantly reduced resistance and were able to secure the hive with minimal casualties. The White Scars' approach to the plagued Marines of the Death Guard evolved significantly during this period. Traditional hit-and-run tactics proved less effective against opponents who showed little concern for casualties and employed contagions that could turn the environment itself into a weapon. In response, the chapter developed specialized protocols for engaging Nurgle's forces, emphasizing target prioritization and contamination management. Tech Marines modified vehicle filtration systems to provide enhanced protection against biological agents, while apothecaries developed field treatments that could temporarily suppress the effects of Nurgle's plagues. Tactical doctrine shifted to emphasize the elimination of biologous putrefiers and other plague weapon specialists before engaging standard Death Guard units, effectively cutting off the source of contamination rather than dealing with its effects. Most significantly, the chapter incorporated Primaris Hellblasters into their traditional mobile warfare approach, using their heavy plasma incinerators to purge infected areas through controlled burning. These adaptations proved particularly effective during the cleansing of Gathalammer, where White Scar's forces encountered a Death Guard strategy specifically designed to counter their mobility advantage. The traitors had deployed networks of plague spores that would activate when disturbed by fast-moving vehicles, creating expanding clouds of contagion that would engulf pursuing forces. Traditional evasive maneuvers would have spread the contamination further, potentially rendering entire battlefields uninhabitable. Instead of withdrawing, the White Scars implemented what they termed burning path tactics. Hellblaster squads deployed from repulsor transports would establish a perimeter around detected spore clusters, using coordinated plasma fire to incinerate the biological weapons before they could fully activate. Once a safe corridor was established, bike squadrons would advance through the sterilized zone to engage Death Guard positions directly, striking before the traitors could deploy replacement spore clusters. This methodical approach represented a significant departure from the chapter's usual fluid tactics, demonstrating their ability to adapt when traditional methods proved ineffective. The threat posed by Tyranid hive fleets presented different challenges entirely. The White Scars had encountered these Xenos sporadically since the late 41st millennium, but the post-Rift era saw dramatically increased Tyranid activity across multiple sectors. The sheer biomass of Tyranid ground forces rendered conventional hit-and-run tactics inefficient. There were simply too many organisms to eliminate through selective strikes, and the Tyranids showed no vulnerability to the psychological warfare that had proven effective against other opponents. The chapter's response demonstrated their pragmatic approach to warfare. Rather than attempting to defeat Tyranid ground forces directly, they focused on disrupting the synaptic control network that coordinated the hive mind's activities. Stormseer librarians worked with veteran scouts to identify and locate synapse creatures, the specialized organisms that extended the hive mind's control across the battlefield. Once these high-value targets were identified, dedicated hunter-killer teams would isolate and eliminate them, creating zones where lower organisms reverted to instinctive behavior. This approach proved particularly effective during the defense of Chogoris itself, when a splinter fleet of Hive Fleet Kraken threatened the chapter's home world in the early years of the Indomitus era. Rather than attempting to engage the entire Tyranid force, Chapter Master Jubal Khan organized his available forces into small, highly mobile strike teams focused exclusively on synapse creatures. These teams operated independently across multiple theaters, creating patterns of disruption that prevented the Tyranids from concentrating their overwhelming numbers effectively. The most significant innovation came through the integration of Vanguard infiltrators into these operations. These Primaris specialists used their enhanced communications equipment to broadcast disruption signals that temporarily confused the synaptic network, creating windows of opportunity for conventional forces to eliminate synapse creatures without facing coordinated resistance. When combined with traditional White Scars mobility, this approach allowed the chapter to effectively counter a Tyranid force that outnumbered them by orders of magnitude, eventually forcing the Splinter Fleet to withdraw in search of less well-defended prey. Throughout the Indomitus Crusade, the White Scars found themselves working alongside Imperial forces with whom they had historically maintained limited interaction. Necessity forced closer cooperation with Astra Militarum regiments, Adeptus Mechanicus contingents, and even other Space Marine chapters with radically different tactical doctrines. These collaborations initially generated friction, as Imperial commanders unfamiliar with White Scars methods often misinterpreted their fluid approach to battlefield positioning as undisciplined or unpredictable. To address these misconceptions, the chapter implemented formal liaison protocols for operations involving multiple Imperial organizations. Veteran sergeants with experience in joint operations were seconded to Imperial command staffs, providing context and interpretation for White Scar's activities while facilitating coordination between different force elements. These liaisons helped translate the chapter's distinctive tactical language into terms that aligned with standard Imperial military doctrine, reducing confusion and improving operational integration. The most successful of these collaborative efforts occurred during the liberation of the Parmenio system, where White Scar's forces operated alongside elements of the Iron Hands chapter and Mechanicus Scutarii legions. Traditional rivalry between the sons of Ferrus Manus and Jaghatai Khan initially created command tensions, with Iron Hands leadership dismissing White Scar's mobility-focused plans as lacking sufficient force concentration. Rather than engaging in doctrinal debates, Khan Kajag invited Iron Hands commanders to observe a demonstration of White Scar's capabilities against a Death Guard stronghold. The resulting operation showcased the chapter's ability to concentrate overwhelming force despite their dispersed deployment pattern. Multiple White Scars strike teams that appeared to be conducting independent actions suddenly converged on a single target from different vectors, creating a momentary but decisive advantage that overwhelmed the Death Guard position before reinforcements could respond. This practical demonstration accomplished what theoretical discussions could not, earning the respect of the Iron Hands and establishing a foundation for effective collaboration throughout the remainder of the campaign. These joint operations gradually shifted perceptions of the White Scars among other Imperial organizations. Where they had once been viewed as unpredictable and difficult to integrate into larger strategic frameworks, they increasingly gained recognition as specialists in asymmetric warfare and rapid response operations. Imperial commanders began specifically requesting White Scar's support for missions requiring these capabilities, acknowledging the unique value they brought to combined arms operations. This evolution in perception extended to the highest levels of Imperial authority. Robute Guilliman himself noted the effectiveness of White Scar's contributions to the Indomitus Crusade, particularly praising their ability to operate effectively with minimal logistical support in regions where supply lines had been compromised by warp activity. In his strategic assessment of Astartes' deployments, the Primarch specifically highlighted the chapter's unparalleled ability to materialize precisely where needed without telegraphing their movements to enemy forces, a significant endorsement from a commander historically associated with more structured and predictable operational patterns. Throughout these campaigns, the question of Jaghatai Khan's possible return remained a constant undercurrent in chapter discourse. The disappearance of their Primarch into the Webway millennia earlier had never received proper resolution, leaving the Sons of Chogoris in a state of perpetual uncertainty, unlike chapters whose Primarchs had definitively fallen. With the return of Guilliman demonstrating that Primarchs could indeed survive into the current era, speculation about Jaghatai's fate intensified among the battle brothers of the White Scars. This speculation gained additional fuel from reports of increased Eldar activity near several ancient Webway portals in sectors adjacent to Chogoris. White Scar's scout teams observed Craftworld forces establishing monitoring stations around these locations, sometimes engaging in skirmishes with Dark Eldar raiding parties in the surrounding areas. Most intriguingly, several of these Craftworld operations appeared to involve Shadowsers and other specialists in Webway navigation, suggesting some specific interest in the network's stability or contents. Chapter Master Jubal Khan authorized limited diplomatic contact with Craftworld representatives to inquire about these activities. The responses, while characteristically cryptic, included several references to ancient hunters and storms trapped in stillness, phrases that many within the chapter interpreted as potential references to their missing Primarch. When pressed for more specific information, the Eldar would only state that certain paths within the Webway that had been dormant for millennia had recently shown signs of activity, necessitating their increased vigilance. These cryptic hints generated considerable debate within the chapter's leadership council. Some argued for committing significant resources to investigating these webway portals directly, potentially mounting expeditions into the labyrinthine network in search of their gene father. Others counseled patience, noting that previous attempts to navigate the webway without Eldar guidance had invariably ended in disaster. The chapter eventually adopted a measured approach, establishing permanent observation posts near known webway entrances, while continuing to gather intelligence from various sources, including carefully cultivated contacts within Eldar society. The belief in Jaghatai's eventual return manifested most visibly in the chapter's preparations for that possibility. The fortress monastery on Chogoris maintained a permanently ready suite of chambers reserved for the Primarch, regularly refreshed and updated with records of significant chapter activities and developments in imperial affairs. The chapter's finest artificers periodically crafted new armor and weapons worthy of their gene father, storing these masterworks in a sealed vault until they might be presented to him. Most poignantly, during major festivals and ceremonies, a ritual place was always set for the Great Khan, with assembled battle brothers leaving a moment of silence in which they believed he might someday appear. This hope for reunion influenced the chapter's strategic planning in subtle but significant ways. Unlike some chapters who operated with complete autonomy, the White Scars maintained their activities within frameworks they believed would meet with Jaghatai's approval upon his return. Major deployments were documented with particular attention to tactical innovations and adaptations, creating a comprehensive record that could eventually demonstrate to their Primarch how his sons had preserved his legacy while evolving to meet new challenges. As the Indomitus Crusade progressed into its later phases, the White Scars found themselves increasingly operating in the galactic east, near the borders of the Tau Empire. This deployment reflected both strategic necessity and the chapter's historical connection to the region surrounding their home world. Their experiences against Tau forces led to significant tactical adaptations, particularly encountering the Xeno's advanced battlesuit technology and supporting drone networks. The White Scars developed specialized jamming equipment that could temporarily disrupt Tau targeting systems, creating windows of opportunity for their fast attack elements to close distance before facing the full effect of Tau firepower. They modified their vehicles with additional ablative plating, specifically designed to absorb pulse weapon impacts, sacrificing some speed for improved survivability against these energy-based weapons. Most significantly, they incorporated lessons from Tau drone tactics into their own operations, using servo skull networks to provide enhanced battlefield awareness for widely dispersed strike teams. These adaptations demonstrated the chapter's continued commitment to evolution without compromise of core principles. They incorporated new technologies and tactical approaches when these offered genuine advantages, but always within frameworks that maintained their fundamental identity as sons of Jaghatai. Their operations against the Tau exemplified this balance, employing new countermeasures and equipment while executing maneuvers that would have been immediately recognizable to White Scars who fought during the Great Crusade. As the galaxy continues to burn in the fires of endless war, the White Scars remain true to the path established by their Primarch 10,000 years earlier. They ride the storm of conflict not as passive participants, but as masters of its currents, striking with precision where others see only chaos. Their lightning raids and thunderous assaults continue to exemplify the perfect marriage of speed and power that has always defined their approach to warfare. Whether their Primarch will ever return from his hunt through the twisted paths of the webway remains unknown. Yet in a very real sense, Jaghatai Khan never left. His spirit lives on in every White Scar who takes to the battlefield, in every lightning strike against the Imperium's foes, in every moment when speed and decision transform certain defeat into unexpected victory. Until the day when the Great Khan might physically return to lead them once more, his sons continue to embody his legacy through their actions, proving with each campaign that they remain worthy inheritors of his genetic and spiritual legacy. In an imperium increasingly defined by desperation and last stands, the white scars offer something precious, the promise that even in the darkest times, there remains space for the exhilaration of the perfect strike, the joy of movement, and the laughter of warriors who understand that true victory comes not from stubbornness alone, but from knowing precisely when and where to apply their strength. As new threats emerge and old enemies return, the sons of Chogoris stand ready to meet them as they always have, with speed, precision, and the unshakable brotherhood that has carried them through 10,000 years of war without end.